This meeting is now being recorded.
Excellent. To implement a new long-term irrigated lands regulatory program, I heard some people earlier talking about it. So I was the point staff drafting that order in the South Valley of the Tulare Lake, and we were faced with a really interesting problem, and it was the recession. 08 recession hits, we're locked down, there's not a lot of money, and in comes this multi-million acre regulatory program that harnesses unknown amount of people, it turns to be tens of thousands of people. We don't have a lot of money and we can't hire a ton of staff. So we had to figure out some way to make this work, and what we did was we took our existing software, Esri and Excel, and we basically formulated a work process to geospatially track compliance and reporting and outreach and mailing and all the stuff that we do as staff in a computer. And during the time, I didn't really think about it because we had no other choice. It was simple, you know, we do what we can with what we have. But what happened next was a shocker. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act passes. Now, I've been a geologist for a while, and I remember trying to ask for data, groundwater data before from my bosses and being told we don't have the statutory authority. And they were right. We didn't have a groundwater law. It was a shocker to me. Well, when that law passed and I read the State Water Board's portion, I thought, wow, that is a very similar problem to the one we just solved. And I'll get into why there's similarities, but first we need to understand Sigma a little bit to understand GEARS, the data system that it sits on. Again, learned that this morning as I tried to talk about GEARS and it went directly to Sigma. So what I'm going to try to do, this is my attempt. We're going to get wild here. I'm fortunate to work with a representative from the Kingdom of Denmark on a memorandum out of the governor's office. And in a meeting while we were setting up a data meeting with Denmark, they said, you know what? We don't want this meeting to just be another slideshow. We want to get people out of their comfort zone. Let's take everybody to the limits of their technological understanding and drop words that aren't fully understood instead of just doing the lowest common denominator. And what happened was amazing. The meeting lit up. People were engaged, and I want to try that right now since this is a data fair and it implies fun. Let's take a little risk, and we're going to get wild. So what we'll do is I'm going to introduce the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. I've taken two 20-minute presentations and slammed them into one text slide. You're welcome. And the concept is we have to know some things about Sigma. We're not going to get them all today. I've got 10 minutes to do the talking. Then we're going to switch gears. Nice. And we're going to start getting more and more technical. I hope for my final slide to be almost beyond capacity. It's at my capacity. So we'll see where we are. We'll start talking tech. Now here's the setup. Data are like water in the sense that water flows, for example, within a channel or a canal. If you change the shape or structure of that canal, you change the flow of the water. Same thing with data. Data resides in a technology or a data architecture. You change this technology or this architecture and you change the flow of data. And that's the focus of this conversation. The reason that that's the focus of this conversation, it's not a demo like our GeoTracker staff showed, is because I am on sprint 5 of 12 of a data system build that will do some pretty impressive things we'll talk about. It means it's not done, so I can't give you a demo. But what I can do is talk about the architecture, the concepts, how it relates to Sigma, and some of the philosophies behind designing the architecture, not just the data. All right, so I want to point out an acronym, SGMA. It's becoming more and more popular. Originally, we were constantly spelling it out. When you see that, it's the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. You'll be seeing it into perpetuity. The other one is GEARS, Groundwater Extraction Annual Reporting System. That's the definition. Now, here's where it gets super cool. If you're familiar with the term of data extensibility, Groundwater Extraction Analysis and Reporting System also works. Has two acronyms. That's a sign of a good data system. All right, so we'll get started. Okay, here we go. Seatbelts. Okay, so Sigma, short version, little light reading. There was no groundwater law until 2014, not a comprehensive one that could really allow the control of the groundwater resources. Sigma was that, is that. What Sigma does is it ensures sustainable groundwater resources by 2042. We might think that's a long time, not to water. If it took 100,000 years to replenish the aquifer and it took half a generation to knock it down a notch, there's a serious timing issue here. And so Sigma ensures that within a few decades, we will be sustainable. It does this in a bimodal approach. One is through the application of the California Department of Water Resources. There's some DWR staff. And the other one is the State Water Board. The law breaks us into two entities basically. And what it says is DWR regulates the groundwater sustainability agencies in locally controlled basins, and that's the premise of SGMA. It's a local control thing. It's the users of the water in those areas that are best suited to manage it, so those should be the ones that manage it. Those groundwater sustainability agencies implement groundwater sustainability plans. Agency implements plans. Now, let's get real here. The odds of 100% success of local control, I will say, are 50-50, just to be fair. There is still another thing necessary, and it's called the backstop, and that's what we do at the State Water Board. We're the other side of this. We manage individual pumpers that are unwilling or unable to maintain that local control that DWR sort of oversees or regulates. Those two zones can be thought of as unmanaged areas and probationary basins. So unmanaged areas can be a simple product of bad GIS for the data GISers. You draw that line wrong, and all of a sudden there's a pumper sitting on one side of the line. Oops. But it also can be other things. It could be hydrogeological in nature. It could be a modification to the Bulletin 118 groundwater basin line. What I'm getting at is that you can end up unmanaged either on accident or by default, but this other one, probationary, whole different ballgame. That is an actual formal hearing by the board. It's all lined out in SGMA, and I don't have time to go into it, but I'll be available afterwards if you want to talk SGMA. So that's the setup for SGMA. Two shops, DWR and State Water Board, local control versus a state-mandated control of groundwater. Both ensure sustainability by 2042. This is a quote that I just find particularly powerful. Big shout to Jessica Bean who developed these slides, just the nice ones. I did the other ones. This kind of sums it up. I think it's beyond discussion that we need to manage our groundwater. This is just a no-brainer. We're a little bit late. But we're here to talk about GEARS, and GEARS is a water board data system, halfway. And so what the responsibilities are that GEARS can help address are, the first one, most importantly, collect the required data. SGMA says our agency has to collect certain data. We will, and we'll do it through GEARS. We need to manage a basin's groundwater. If we're in a probationary situation, we're in control. We need to do it right. We need to achieve sustainability. We also need to administer the hearings and all the formal stuff that goes on with the transfer to probation. We need to, of course, this is every day, all day. We need to ensure compliance with our orders. This is being a state regulator. And then we need to facilitate return to local control. We're not meant to be in charge of these basins. We're a backstop. We're the safety net. We want to get them back into local control. And GEARS was built to assist that specifically. If we're going to be collecting data, perhaps millions of data, we need to make them available in a form useful to the incoming local GSA. So that's the setup for how SGMA relates to a data system. Because everybody wants to know what the deadlines are, here they are. So there's far more than this, but we're going out to 2025. This is how you end up having to report to GEARS, basically. You do not have a GSA, a sustainability agency in place, thereby you are unmanaged and you fall into that category. And then there's some minutia that go on, critically overdrafted basins, and it kind of steps out. There's implementation deadlines. So from 2025 on, there's a couple of deadlines, but it's basically that's where SGMA comes to life, and we begin to control the groundwater in these high and medium priority basins in California. So here's the reporting process, and this is from the staff view. Another thing to point out is that reporting is very different to a staff member that collects reports versus somebody reporting. I mean, if you do thousands of reports, it's a lot easier than if it's your first time ever reporting. So from the staff view, the first thing we have to do is identify extractors. Congratulations, your basin may have 100,000 pumpers. Find them. Well, that's not exactly easy. These pumps are hard to find from a satellite photo. They're nearly imperceptible. Once we find them, and I'll show you how we plan to do this, we'll notify the extractors via mail, and then we collect reports from those extractors responding to those pieces of mail. We review those reports as staff, and there will be fees on the back end. The state is not going to control groundwater basins for free. The locals are going to be billed for the services we provide, managing groundwater. But that's the reporting process and sort of the continuity that GEARS has to capture. So this is how it looks to the extractor. So now we're on the other side. We're on the ground. We get our letter. It says receive notification. You create your online account. You file your report with GEARS. December 15th is one of the statutory dates for submitting reports. And then you either receive your invoice and pay your fees because you're an extractor, or you're de minimis, or you didn't have a well, and you off-ramp and you're no longer part of it. The way that we do this well discovery thing is really fascinating. It's an objective data process. What this means is there's not a lot of staff subjective opinions in deciding if a parcel has a well or not. It's data-driven. It's based on geospatial layers, information. These geospatial layers are functionally stacked on each other so that each assessor's parcel receives a rank, and that rank then sets the scale for if they probably have a well, or they definitely have one, there's no chance of having one, and that determines our mailings. So it's a really cool data-driven way to cover millions of acres in a computer without having staff going parcel by parcel. This is one of the things we figured out in the Irrigated Lands program. We had to start working on a geospatial context. When you hit these multi-million acre regulatory schemas, you can't do it with manual paper and fingers. Too many paper cuts. So we're probably familiar with a lot of these. Remote sensing is a huge part of this. I would go on for an hour just on that piece, but keep your eye on remote sensing as we move forward. This is an example of this. I'm not sure if this is a demonstration or this might be real data, but this is just an example of how it might look to a staff member as we're like, okay, see the different colors? Well, they mean different things, and you get your geospatial statistics out of it. It gives you an idea of the magnitude that we're working with. So now we're going to shift gears. Good timing. Am I flying? All right. We're going to shift gears now, and we're going to start getting more and more technical. We're going to start talking about the architecture of a data system. We're going to talk about the Agile Build process and its applicability to state government data system development. It's a great way to build programs and software. The first thing when I was given the task of developing this data system was, so we have a couple issues we need to figure out this data system has to get around. One, we have an irregular reporting volume. If you think about it, I'm from the Tulare Lake Basin, Fresno, King, Tulare, Kern counties. My ballpark as a geologist coming from that area, there's at least a few 100,000 wells. If something went wrong, SGMA doesn't say there's an upper limit for the board. It says that we're going to protect the water. And so in designing gears, I thought this thing needs to be scalable up to humongous reporting volumes, but we can't be spending $20 million on hard infrastructure and then not have any reports. That doesn't make sense. I'll show you how we figured that out. Unfamiliar reporters. It's one thing to work in the dairy program where all your dairy operators understand the reporting process, or landfills, Title 27, where we have engineers on staff. We will be contacting everything from English as a second language, disadvantaged communities, tech savvy, not tech savvy. So we have to have a reporting process that works for everybody. It can't be too complicated. It has to work for the average Joe, basically. And then changing rules and regulations. As we saw with Assembly Bill 1755, which we can talk about, I don't expect California law to be static over the next 20 years. There's going to be new rules, bills, regulations. We need to build extensible architectures so we can adapt our data systems to whatever legislature or the public needs them to do. This is a different process than what we call the brick build. I built a brick. It was a brick yesterday, it's a brick today. Check out that brick. 20 years, it's still a brick. We need to be able to modify it and turn it into other things. So that was a big challenge for gears, so we worked our way around that. This was the one that got me when I read SGMA. It is the intent of legislature to improve data collection and understanding about groundwater. Thank goodness. Considering we just came from decades of having minimal data collection, we need to do this bad. So the water code actually set us up for it. Perfect. So how do we get around some of those concepts that I said were troublesome to implementing the backstop? Well, one is AWS scalable cloud architectures. The second I heard that there were pay for only what you use architectures, bingo. That's how you can accommodate 1 million reporters, we'll just make a big number, or one. And you don't pay tons of money. You have to build the system, sit it in an elastic cloud system, a load balance system, and it will scale up as you need. So the other thing that is important for reporting volume is spatial. So it's one thing to take reports from an area. It's another to take it from a few million acres. We learned in the ag program the best way to track this is using GIS. So what we did was we built gears on top of a geospatial data engine. Gears is time and space aware. So it knows when a report was submitted and then where in history, and then where there might be areas over time that may have compliance issues or there's great compliance. So we can start to gauge these things from a map view. And that lets us better allocate our resources because we only have what we have. The unfamiliar reporter part, that's a challenge for everybody. TurboTax had this problem. So one of the best ways, first of all, make it simple. Make your UI simple. The more buttons you have, the slower the process. But more importantly, quality control the data at the point of input. Don't allow data to come into the architecture that is bad. Use valid values. Use geospatial logic, which Gears does. Make sure that the only thing that can be reported are useful quality control data. The help and hoverovers, those are helpful. And then I'm sorry to say it, but there's some people, I don't know that there's anything we could do. I'm serious. It's not the bulk, but there's a tail that is, they're just going to be challenged. And that's okay. We're used to it. You'll call us. And we'll have to, I have a plan for YouTube videos and self-help, but there's this component also. Sometimes you got to pick up the phone and help somebody out. So the other thing is changeable rules, changing rules. Extensible data system architectures are fundamental to this. One of the things is we own the code to Gears, therefore we own the code base. That way we can modify this code base. We don't get stuck in any scenario where we might be in what is known as a SaaS contract hostage situation. It's happened before. There's history of this. By owning our own code, we can then just have vendors modify the pieces we need as legislature, public, or the agency requires new information. Also, there's a modifiable fee schedule. Like I said, we have to recollect the fees that we expend for the backstop, and this is expected to change. And these fee schedules are adopted by the board. So what do you do? How do you hard bake in a fee calculator into a data system if it's going to change? Well, you make sure that the structure of the fees are modifiable. That tells Gears in time and space when it's calculating fees that it's using the applicable and appropriate fee schedule. The beauty of this is you can report for 4 water years ago, and it'll know the fee schedule back then. Or it will keep aware of that. And if the board chooses to go that route, that's how we can go. Getting to the concept of extensibility. So one other part is configurable fields. It's funny how things change from a mandatory field to an optional. It's kind of up to interpretation sometimes. So we made sure that our fields are configurable from the staff level, admin config. So the Agile Build, I bring this up because it's very powerful in civil service. A one and done or waterfall technique of building a data system is, here's $1 million, I'll see you in a year. And in 1 year, you come back and hope that it's right because that contract's over. The other way to do this is to build in sprints. You build it in a bunch of small chunks. Gears is in a 12-sprint build. We're on sprint 5. We're 42% complete with the code. What that means is when the San Andreas goes off, there's a dam failure, and we hit a recession all at once, even if everything slams to a stop, you have a functioning data system. And you build the data system with the concept of starting with your core architecture, then finalizing it into its final form, actually in a second contract in the event that, something goes wrong. At least you have a core architecture. Then you make it to what its design is. Then if you want by that time, you probably have enhancements. Another program has approached you and said, hey, you know what, can't you modify that thing? You can do a third or a fourth contract. That way it's not a brick. The system can live. You're safe in the event of recession or lack of funding. There's a long history in California of failed data systems that have attempted these single builds, and the person quits or something and just leaves the agency holding the bag. That's no good. So the other thing that is pretty cool in an Agile Build is you do a joint application development right up front. That's where you sit down with the software engineers and talk it out. It was amazing being in this because we speak 2 different languages between scientists and software engineers, but it's really important so you can come to a common understanding. User story development, don't worry about that. 12 sprints and regression testing, again, catch me outside. We'll go into the weeds. And then maintenance enhancements. These systems are alive. You got to keep them alive. They require food and water. They require money. But, okay, so here's the Gears build timeline. Started in 2015 with design requirements. Stage 1 business analysis for the stage gators. With summer 2016, we did a request for information thereafter. This is a good mechanism because when you request information from the private sector, you can find out things that you didn't know. We sort of rely on our public sector partners to inform us of what's available. Request for offer, spring 2017. Contract awarded summer 2017. Got into that JAD with the software engineers. That was fun. Fall 2017. And then sprint 1 through 5. We are finishing sprint 5, Joe, next week. So that's where we are at 42%. Sprint 6 through 12 happened March through August 2018. All right, here's the components of GEARS. I'm going to fly here because I want to try something special at the end. Because here's the components of GEARS. Users and authentication. You got to log on. You got a password, of course. Well details. The well is a geospatial asset. I mentioned that the system is geospatially aware. So it knows where the well is in space, and other than in Kern County wells that sometimes extrude because of subsidence, wells don't move. They're pretty static. And so that's cool. Let's just store it in a geospatial asset. That way the reporter doesn't have to declare every single report what their well information is. It's not really changing much. Place of use changes a little, but similarly, land is land. Extraction reporting, there's some basics. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So GEARS accepts extraction reports. That's its primary function. Outreach and mail tracking, we talked about multi-million acre regulatory processes, better done in a GIS. Fee calculations, modifiable fee schedule. Compliance tracking, we issued a letter 30 days ago. 30 days has passed. Turn the parcel red, indicating a second letter is needed. Those types of mail tracking processes. Also, a letter was issued. That parcel has now enrolled with GEARS. Flip the parcel to green. We have confirmation of compliance. The other part is uploads and comments, and this is crazy powerful for how simple it is. Attaching documents to your well, attaching documents to your place of use, or attaching documents to yourself. What that means is when a well owner changes 4 or 5 times over 20 years, we have the entire record attached to that well, not just to the owner. Those who have dealt with the CWIC's place and party IDs know the complexity of attaching a person to a place. It's very difficult, but by using geospatial abstraction, by taking these data and abstracting them into a GIS feature, you give yourself a layer of flexibility to keep your records straight. I thought that was really powerful for as simple as it is. And lastly, tabular report generation. This is basic. PDF, Adobe does it. Got a bunch of fields. The database puts the data in the fields and you print a PDF out. It's super simple. So GEARS does that on the back end in the event that an extractor wants their data back, which we want to give them. So here's the extractor process. Ease of reporting and data access is all UI UX. Now, is that confusing? See, I told you we're getting more technical. So it's all user interface and user experience. If you scare a reporter right off the bat, the phone's going to ring. They're going to be like, I don't know what this is, help me. When you're dealing with 1,000, 10,000, 50,000, you don't want the phones ringing like that. So you want as much help in UI UX up front. You want simple well location and place of use mapping. We're going to show it. I'm going to do a demo. We're going to watch GEARS in a second. Storage of GIS and user info for future reporting blew me away. Once I submitted my first demo extraction report and realized you could do it in 25 seconds, 30 seconds report, because all of the information is the same. Your well didn't get up and move. The only thing that changed was the amount of water that came out of it that particular reporting period. Reporting times dropped significantly. So we'll take a look at a demo of that and then download a geospatial assets for external GIS work. So if GEARS is already a geospatial engine, why not provide geospatial data out of the back end to the users, especially those locals that come back into control of that groundwater basin? Let's hand them all the data we've collected, organized in a geospatial context, back to the local level so they have the greatest chance of success under Sigma. Now, for the staff side, not to be selfish, geospatial tracking of space and time is kind of the only way to do it. I think that's like the 4th time I've said it. We're not going to do it with manpower. But the automatic tracking of reporters against issued letters, that's new. We actually automated a manual business process that staff do right now in code, eliminating staff from the process. Fortunately, we're not private sector, so staff are not in danger of losing their jobs. We'll just simply be repurposed. But the fact is, it's the automation of business processes that's the key to data systems. It's not just collecting data. So case management of individual users and assets. If you've ever seen a dusty pile of papers at any sort of regulatory area, you know how difficult manual case management is. Why not automate it in the box? Let's make sure that the records are attached to the right people. And then the auto PDF report generation. Techie. So this is the tech stack. I didn't expect anyone to know about any of this. I don't. I just learned about this over the last year pretty much. We're using an in-tier architecture, and I'm not even going to go into it. If you know what these words are, good. If you don't, good. You now know where that limit is. And if you want to talk geek or tech or want to know what these words mean, catch me in the mezzanine. I'd be more than happy to talk about it. This is even worse. I'm not going to talk. This is just like, wow, but that's real. That's the entity relationship diagram between the tables inside of GEARS. Notice the well-centric data architecture. That's right. It's all attached to the well. The Sigma is all about wells. It's all about the point of extraction. So enough tech. I'm going to do something risky and show you a video screen capture I did yesterday of this whole thing. I need a favor in that we are basically 50% of the way through this build, and we have not yet applied lipstick or mascara. This is a wireframe mock-up, but that's not the point. Halfway through the build, you're focusing on architectures. So I want to demonstrate the architectures. And if you have advice or on aesthetics, please, this is a stakeholder engagement to me. So provide advice after this, and we'll see if we can't get it into gears. Kick it into gear. All right, so let's play this thing, and I'll just sort of talk through it. No, the mouse is wildly on its own. Normal entry, right? Everyone's seen this before. Your email has to be authenticated. When you register with Gears, you get a confirmation email to ensure that we're not getting botted. You declare a password. It's amazing how much goes into a I forgot my password business flow. I was blown away. It's like 2 pages of flow charts. It's amazing. This is the dashboard. This is where the user will be doing their business, basically. There'll be one for reporters and one for staff that look different. This is just the reporter one. Manage your information, manage your well, manage your place of use, look at all your documents, change your password, do your account stuff. Pretty basic at this level. Pretty basic at this level. You put stuff in there. This person's name is Dingus Humperdinck, and they work for the company Nerf. Yeah, using Mailinator because we're generating like 10 emails a day doing systems testing. Now, this is where you manage an agent. Perhaps you have an engineer working for you, and you want them to submit your reports. Well, you can declare them here with a double handshake. You send an email saying, I want you to be my agent. Agent confirms. Extractor confirms. They're the agent, or the other way around. The agent can approach the extractor, but there's a double confirmation on record, and then you can allow somebody else to report for you. Don't worry about that bottom one. That's gone now. But those are just all so I could see how many agents we've done. So here's the cool part. File extraction report. But first, we need to know where the well and the place of use are. So let's plot a well. Here's 3 wells that are already plotted. We're going to plot another one. See how they're all weird letters? It's because when you're testing all day, you're not really trying to type stuff. You're just trying to get it done. So here's your well information, basic regulatory stuff. If it's a public water supply system, put in your number here. If you're in these 4 counties subject to the Groundwater Recordation Program, click this box. But more importantly is this. So I'm doing a random plot outside of Fresno right here. We're going to put our well on the ground. And I actually accidentally did this. I accidentally landed on a well pad. So that was a total mistake. And so this makes sure that you're zoomed in when you plot your well, so you're not plotting from space and putting it in the neighboring county. So after you plot your well, you can put in information. It auto-populates the longitude and latitude because it's geospatially enabled. You put in your other information for your well, the well name, if you have the USGS name, the state CASGEM well name that's available. You can change the status of the well. Let's say you're running a 1,000-acre operation. You have 5 wells and you're rotating them. Well, maybe you don't want to report for the one you didn't use. You can set it to inactive, but not delete the asset, right? Because you're going to fire it back up later. Maybe you need to report for it. So we're going to name the well here. I chose a lot of almonds because that's a lot of almonds, basically, that's on the ground right there. I'm from Fresno, so I'm really used to almonds. And then I put for the well construction log, check that out. Do you have a well construction log? The whole point is not to fix this issue. It's to make sure that when we do fix it, our data are set up to support fixing it. So if we know who's got the well logs, we can hit DWR and everybody else try to figure it out down the road. Screened intervals, we are in the world of Z. Sigma put us underground. As soon as that groundwater law hit, everything got real important as far as screened intervals and all that stuff that we have minimal data on. So you collect it here. At this point, you'll save the well. This took shockingly long. This is typically immediate. I don't know why it hung right here, but I will report the bug. Come on. Okay, now you got to pick a place of use. You're not done. When you plot your well, you got to say where the water goes. So in this one, I would imagine it's those fields. So you click on them. Clicky, go Brent. Click Brent. Click. Click Brent. Do it. There you go. All right. So that's how you select your place of use. You can turn it on and off. You can modify them later. It's not static, but it's a geospatial asset. And then you put your information over here in your asset. What's the name of that? What do I put this time? A lot of almonds place of use is almonds for days. All right, so it's an active place of use. Now you select your purpose of use. It's clearly irrigated agriculture. Maybe you have a secondary purpose of use because you got a spigot coming off to a pressure tank and you're drinking off of it. Well, then that's an individual supply. You have irrigated acreage that populates once you select the ag drop down. That lets you put in irrigated ag if you want. And you can choose your irrigated method too. If you're using drip, I know they're using drip. So you can select all that and it stores it with the geospatial asset. Okay, now what? Well, now you report. Once you have these assets in there, you don't need to do it again once they're in there unless something changes. So save. And we'll go back to the dashboard. Oh, yeah, there's our new well, by the way. You can see a lot of almonds. Come on, Brent. I'm pressed for time. All right. Now we're going to do an extraction report. Click it. This is why I want to do a live demo. I thought I was flying when I was recording this yesterday. It's like, slow down. Okay. Here's your extraction reports that you've submitted before. Every year you'd have to submit one. You can filter by your well. Maybe you have 50 wells. You've been reporting for 10 years. That's a lot of reports. We'll filter then. Pick your well or pick your water years, and it helps you filter down so you can download your report that you've already submitted, but we want to submit a new one. Create extraction report. Legalese, you're not submitting much without clearing this hurdle. So I understand. First thing, what water year are you reporting for? So, pick one. Great. Now there's your wells. See a lot of almonds? Those will be way prettier, by the way. Remember, no makeup yet. So a lot of almonds. That tells Gears we're reporting for this well. You have to submit a report for each well. But it's painless. And that's it. There's your extraction report. Notice it's a 3-part thing. There's 12 months and a comment bubble. And you either say, I know these values are true because I got them from a meter, or I had to estimate. And we'll have a pop-up box when you do unmetered estimated that requires an explanation of, was this a wild guess? Because why? You guys better have a method. So you put in your values. 2 acre-foot, I guess, was mine for this. And then you say, hi, boards, in the comment, or you say, grrr, you don't want to be reporting. But it's a comment that can help us on the back end. You submit the report. There's a summary. All this is are you sure everything's correct? Again, this will be much prettier when we're all done. But there's your map. It made it for you. Since you're in GIS, why not make a map? All your stuff. Scroll down. That's it. And there's your commitment. Submit report. Look, it calculates your total annual extraction. Runs into the fee calculator. That's not a real fee, by the way. That's just a number we typed in there. But it will calculate the fee based on the fee schedule that we assign to Gears. And then you, drum roll. Thank you. Not yet. You got to sign it. So here's your electronic signature. And once you put in the dingus humperdink, you will be ready to submit your extraction report. Bam, that's it. So that's a new way of reporting. It's a different data architecture completely from what I'm used to, at least. We'll go ahead and pause this. What I do next, we're out of time, but what I do next is I go through an extraction report as fast as I can, as if I already had my assets on the ground, and I can clear it in under 20 seconds. Now, that's not a good thing. I'm not saying people should be doing that. I'm saying that this is a new way of reporting data at high volumes in a controlled manner so that we have the best data inside of the system possible to provide back to the locals. So I'm going to close it off right now. There's my info. If you want to talk tech, data, Sigma, California water in general, give me a buzz. There's a groundwater management program that we work for. You can check out our website. Department has their own website. There's data systems coming out pretty frequently. Keep your eyes open. All right. Well, with that, we're 3 minutes over, but maybe a question or two? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Brent.
Sure.
Any questions for Brent?
I had a question on, you see the latitude and longitude of the well location. How do you suggest the property owners go on there? How do you suggest they
Great. Yeah, so that's the beauty of using a geospatial data engine inside of the reporting tool. You have two choices. You can have a paper record in which you type the longitude and latitude in because you have it. Or you can do what I did in that demo, and you can literally zoom down and plot the well yourself. Yeah, so it really comes down to the resolution of the base photo, right? Like how accurate you're going to be. You saw when I drilled down to that well pad, that was probably a 2 meter by 3 meter well pad, and it was real fuzzy. Wait for 5 years. Wait until we get down to the 10 meter resolution. You'll be plotting on the property line. So, yeah, great question.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions over here?
So a couple times you talked about parcels. What's the relationship of the parcel to the well in the database?
Yeah, sure. So wells are points, features in a geospatial data engine. So they have a coordinate, but a parcel is an area. It's a polygon. And what the parcels represent is a consistent fabric across California that is spatially contiguous. There's no holes. People aren't trying to give up their land, right? Everyone wants it. There's a hole, someone buy it. So there's a consistent layer that's spatial. Because we know the owners of the properties, we can send mail to them. And the relationship is we need to find the well owner. Who are they? Well, who owns that land? Okay, we know who that is. They get the letter. You have a well on your property, and it's subject to Sigma. Call us, confirm, talk to the owner, whatever you have to do to comply. So it's both a spatial tracking fabric that's consistent across the basin, and it's an information item to guide outreach and letter delivery.
This could be super down in the weeds. Sorry if it is. Parcel data. So are you guys using a commercially available product to get that edge to edge? Because counties don't have that data edge to edge.
You got it, man. We fought this one. So we have 58 counties doing it 58 different ways. And it's all public data, and as far as I know, up until recently, there wasn't a lot of hope of a consistent, publicly available statewide parcel layer, leaving it wide open to the private industry to do that, which is what we have to deal with. We have a company, I believe we're contracted with Land Vision, Joe? Land Vision? I think it's Land Vision. And they do the topology, it's the topology matching, and they do the unique identifiers across all 58 counties, so you don't have to match APNs. That's a crazy nightmare at the staff level. You
want a hyphen, no hyphen? You want letters, no letters, 9 digits, 12, 14?
We are doing this manually at the staff level. So that's one of the benefits of the third party helping us with that, and maybe until California ends up with our public data provided back. Yeah,
email people about that.
Yeah, serious. Another one of those legislation asks, like.
Two more over here.
It's a quick question.
Yeah.
Quick question. So the people that are reporting this system, are only the people that are out of line with regulation, or is everyone across the board going to report for this?
Just those subject to the backstop. Just those that are unwilling or unable to manage their own water. And it could be a few out in an unmanaged area. It could be thousands in a probationary basin. So, yeah. I think you can, if you want. I think you can report to it if you want. There's not a geospatial criteria that says, hey, you can't.
Yeah.
But I don't.
But just in the context of groundwater modeling, which I do.
Yeah.
Groundwater pumping is often a closure term in the budget. I have to create groundwater pumping data to calibrate. Help validate some of the satellite metrics and graces.
That's exactly it. That's what we are planning on. That's why this is built in this context. It's to return the basin back to local control with the subcontext of addition of satellite remote sensing and data fusion, and also groundwater modeling. That's why Gears is geospatial. It puts you directly into a three-dimensional, time-enabled framework so you can model it in ModFlow, IWFM, or whatever.
For other SGMAs that are existing, that are still doing things the old-fashioned way, would there be any way for them to utilize this system to streamline their reporting and maybe save some money?
Thank you. I sure hope so. I really, really hope so. In fact, my original design, when I was doing the original architecture of Gears, it was a fully open-source software. For the nerds, it ran on PostgreSQL, PostGIS. Unfortunately, in order to get the build done, we had to switch back to proprietary software. So it's SQL Server and Esri. That means there's a price point attached to running Gears. If it was open source, we probably could provide it to the public for free as an executable or something, just for water managers to manage their water data on their own in a format that's compatible with at least the backstop. If people would do that or not, I don't know. It's it's kind of crossing boundaries there, but I think there's value in turning Gears into a publicly available tool. We've also talked about, I'm not a big fan of services as software, but we could provide Gears out as a service as a software, absorb the licensing fees and provide it. I haven't talked about that with anybody, but there's a possibility that the architecture could be used for those that are without.
And with that provocative thought, I will thank Brent again for your time and your presentation. And thank you all for being patient for the morning. We ran over about 10 minutes, but I neglected to introduce my strong partner on this day, Imagine H2O's Nashali Kaplan-Daly, who's probably out there now. I don't see her in the room. But Imagine H2O brought amazing vendors they run their own incubation process where they run a competition essentially, and people from around the world enter, and they had their whole wrap up a week and a half ago. So one of the benefits is they have vendors still around that are interested. So there's 8 amazing vendors from Imagine H2O out there with the group. So thank you everyone for coming for the morning. We have for coming back or coming to the afternoon part of the session. So my name is Greg Gerhardt. I'm Deputy Director of Information Management and Analysis at the State Water Board. And this is the afternoon session of the data fair. I think, are we having okay functionality online, Jarma? Okay. Good. So I'd like to introduce our kickoff for the afternoon speaker. It's board member Joaquin Esquivel. He's our newest board member, and he comes with a very savvy data purpose to his direction to staff and to the projects that we work on. And he has experience with technology and data, and we are very appreciative of him on the board, but most appreciative of him coming today to give some time and to talk. So with that, Joaquin Esquivel.
Thanks, Greg, and I think more importantly, thank all of you for coming here. Again, it's Good Friday. Everyone's ready for a weekend here, so your attendance is well appreciated. Out of curiosity, actually, who in the room here is a member of the public that's just generally interested in data and the board's work around data? Great. And how many are from academics, academic quarters? How many are staff here? And how many are, just program app developers or whatnot? Okay. Well, great. Just wanted to get a sense of any regulated entities or agency partners? Yeah, state agency partners? Okay. Well, that's helpful. And again, thank you guys for being here. I was very fortunate in my previous life to have worked for Senator Boxer for a number of years, both on the policy side and the administration side. So I was a legislative assistant, but I was also the IT director for the office. So when I grew particularly frustrated with the lack of progress on sometimes just really small pieces of legislation, small changes to try to get through in D.C., I always had the administrative side to default on, which, being able to direct budgets and have programs and have end times to those programs sometimes alleviated what is otherwise the existential crisis that might set in at any moment, wondering if I'm really making a difference in the work that I was doing. Particularly the challenges in that role were that we had about a staff of about 70, and that included all of our state staff, but a constituency of 40 million. And so when you have such low staff resources and a high volume of connectivity with those constituents in the form of emails, mail, meetings, whatever it may be, it becomes critically important to use information and data systems to actually effectuate the work that we want. And that's all the more true for the work here at the board and the struggle that we have in trying to continue to improve the quality of our waters, to manage a water rights system, and all the regulatory oversight that goes into the programs to ensure that. And so coming to now the board, I'm fortunate to work with incredible staff, as you've seen so far today, on what are a myriad number of systems, many of them in some cases that are maybe past their life cycle and are needing to be updated, but really a matter of how do we, particularly with the inclusion of the drinking water program, so for those of you that I'm sure most of you know, but those that don't, the Division of Drinking Water was formerly held at Department of Public Health, came over to the board, so it is now yet another new aspect to the mission of the board, and another complex set of data systems and programs that are, within this purview of the board. So what I've become increasingly interested in is how do we comb that into more manageable and actionable information? How do we, not have to have one database to rule them all and somehow reinvent the wheel because, we can't. But how do we begin to make the connections and the interoperability between that data so that at the back end, it gives us the consequence of being able to just better understand the actions that we're undertaking. It's been noted already, but Sigma is going to be a huge driver for a lot of this change and a lot of this need that's out there, and it's not going to be driven or held by us, but by all these myriad 500 plus groundwater sustainability agencies, and so the lift is pretty incredible. So how do we continue to feed into a common system that allows us all, and wherever that may be, whether you're a regulated entity, whether you're in academics, whether you're a member of the public, how do we all continue to feed into a common system and come to common understandings? Because I think it's no surprise. Obviously, there's a lot of tension around the management of water resources in the state. And I'm a firm believer that tension can be offset or at least put into productive space by focusing on the information, focusing on the data, focusing on our sophistication of the understanding of what that data is trying to tell us in the interaction between groundwater or surface water, wherever it may be. And so we here at the board, as you have well known, I think at this point, are committed to being partners and collaborators in that. And it comes with a slight nuance insofar as we're also the regulators, and there's mistrust that comes from that. There is a feeling of, why do I want to provide data to an entity that will use it to then regulate me potentially further than I already am, or financial consequences to something that may be found. So there's this inherent tension, I think, between what are the goals of the board and for everyone to have open and transparent data and open and transparent decisions, and a sort of holding of the cards from some entities because they feel they can't trust the board, or that, again, if they provide information, it will be used to regulate. So how do we, but that trust is critical and important, and I think so, particularly so when we think about the scope of work in our watersheds, that we need to really be focused on our point source programs. They're all 40 years in the making. They're running, they're humming along, they're collecting an incredible amount of information, and this next panel, as we transition over, will be more about the specifics of the National Pollutant Discharge and Elimination System and our data collection through that process, so getting really focused in on an actual program at the board to further explore. But so how do we, again, take advantage of maybe data that we're already collecting, as opposed to saying, well, what more information do we need? How do we just look at our own space here at the board and say, how do we, and better contribute to what is a very robust discussion happening out there and a lot of interest from people, and an exciting time to be able to even be allowed to work in this space. So I think I'll kind of leave it at that. I thank you all for, again, your attendance and your interest. And, this is an ongoing conversation, an iterative conversation. So, do explore the data that's on our website. Greg and his team have done a pretty fantastic job of, again, combing through what are many different systems that our various programs depend upon, and at least identifying where people can go for that different information. And we'll continue to do our job about making all that a little more manageable for, again, whatever your level of involvement or expertise may be, whether you're a member of the public or a regulated entity, et cetera. We're here and we're committed, and I know that it's certainly a passion of mine, and but we don't do it without all of your involvement. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Joaquin. It's so refreshing. We have the best board ever. People are nodding their heads. I've worked here 24 years, as I said earlier, but we really have the best board right now, and part of it is by this new leadership that we're getting from Joaquin and stuff. So thank you for being here, and thank you for also supporting what we're trying to do, which is make our data more accessible. So I'm going to give a shortish presentation of sort of framing this issue, but what we're going to do today is sort of experimental, so I'm really glad you guys are here to go through this experiment with me. We're going to dive into the world of a program that is involved with data heavily. It both requires people to give us data. It generates its own sort of data. It consumes data to keep running. It is part of our fee system. It's a big part of our fee system and how we get paid as an organization. And that data that it has is also connected to many other programs, and we're going to explore this together. I don't have the answers. When we get to the panel part, you'll see that I'm going to try to moderate a conversation of just exploring. So keep in mind this image of we're walking into a cave with flashlights together, and nobody is here to sort of be on the firing line, so to speak, of answering questions, pointed questions. But go ahead and ask them. I'll just try to deflect them and remind us that we're in this together. So with that in mind, that describes my job, which is walking around with a flashlight trying to find data. Anyone in the audience know what this picture depicts? Minamata. So this is a Minamata disease photograph from the 70s. I became encountered with this in my youth in college. I was lucky enough to have a dad that was an environmental engineering professor that went around the world and worked on stuff. So I'd heard about this. There was a book. But this was a mercury contamination problem in Japan. And there was an industrial pollutant that went into the bay. The people ate the material in the bay. And they were subjected to all sorts of adverse health effects, including some of these birth defects that were so evident. I bring this up because it's something that happens in our lifetime, and it affects a lot of people, but it also drives the program. It drives the organization. We don't see this kind of thing, luckily, in California, but we do see the artifacts of it. We see mercury being required as a contaminant. Sorry, I didn't plan to break up on it, but we see the permits driving people to try to solve these problems. We see scientists and academics struggling to try to communicate the problem. So this is an important photograph for me for that reason, but it's also part of the history of the organization, the history of my interaction with it, and the role that we play as a regulatory agency that wasn't really present at the time, right? So I tried to come up with some questions that relate to mercury when I was trying to think of how to open this. We have a lot of management questions that pop up, and they continue to pop up throughout this day. So which communities in California are affected by mercury? We don't have necessarily the industry problem, but we have a legacy problem in California. The mercury is in our system, and it's working its way around, right? So there's people in the room that know way more about mercury than I do. I'm not going to try to pretend that I know it, but I will say that it's been one of these themes that keeps coming up in my career. I had a job in the Bay Area working on TMDLs where the assignment was to work with these folks out of Santa Clara and develop the first round of mercury work on the TMDL for the Guadalupe River. One of the staff from the state board came to help us understand the mercury in the system. Those of you who don't know, New Almaden mine is right outside of San Jose, and it was the second largest mercury producing mine in the world behind Almaden, I think, in Spain. And so in that system, the Guadalupe River, from downstream of there to the bay, is mercury. And the staff person, how many remember Rick Humphreys? Okay, so Rick was the guy. He came out with his sort of cowboy swagger of mercury and river geology experience, and he brought his panning material. And we went out as a team that was working on this project, and we panned elemental mercury out of the sediment of Guadalupe River. And I remember that. It was like, and I tell people about that, like, no, that's not really possible. And I think it's probably still possible today. So, and then it goes down in the bay and it hits the bay sediments and it turns into methyl mercury through a process. And then it starts becoming more available and it gets in the food chain. And there are people literally that consume the fish that are exposed to these risks. So we have all sorts of questions. Who, where, what kinds of factors affect exposure? How do we engage? What do we do for interventions? What kind of things are we doing besides writing a lot of paper that maybe has horizons like 20? Those of you who recall the SF Bay Mercury TMDL, what was the original realistic date of flushing? It was like 225 years or something like that. And the state board rejected it. They said, that's ridiculous. We can't adopt a TMDL document that has 225 years in it. But the reality is that that's what it's going to take to sort of flush that kind of stuff out of that system. So we have to be smarter. The world is changing. We've got all these drivers of climate change, flood, fire, drought, not drought, new normal, whatever you want to call it, that's coming. So we just have to be smarter. And mercury is it's going to be one of the things I'm going to try to touch on throughout the day. So these are the questions that pop up. They'll pop up throughout the day, but they also are not going away in our regulatory worlds, and there's multiple agencies that work on it. How many people here have something to do with mercury, by the way? Anything to do with mercury? That's about a third at least, maybe more. That's pretty impressive. Okay, so mercury, we're data rich, but we're information. I'll let you fill in the blank. So I went searching for information on mercury. No, that's not it. Not that one. And then I looked. No, that's not it either. No. And I found finally our not to like use ourselves as an example, but I will. The My Water Quality webpage has a map that sort of says here's where you can find advisories in California, and so it's a bunch of dots on a map. So we can do better is my message for turning data into information. We often also, one of the other sort of experiences that touched on this thread in my life is I sat in a management meeting, not in our current management structure, but in prior world, where the decision was, do you allow water to go into a bypass for the purpose of juvenile salmon habitat and producing more juvenile salmon in the system? If you do that, though, you're going to also provide the conditions needed for methylation, which will produce more methylmercury and potentially raise fish tissue mercury. The decision was made in a room with people without data. A lot of experience, a lot of knowledge in the room, but there was not a single moment where somebody said, I wonder if we could see the numbers and make a risk decision based on the numbers. So I'm hoping one of the things that changes in my career and lifetime is that we provide data for those kinds of moments, and that we have the patience to sort of ask those kinds of questions because they're big. Maybe fish is better than salmon or tissue concern in some cases, but wouldn't it be nice to know we have data everywhere on this stuff? Mercury in the system is really studied. So with that, I'll back up and sort of go into the objective mode of what do we do and why do we do it. So as you all know in the room, that data, and Jay Lund said it really well in an opinion piece. He didn't see it on his blog. But data is governed just like water is governed at this point because it's a very fractured system that has lots of different points of entry and control. So we have many federal agencies, many state agencies. We have thousands of local agencies. It's literally not known, I think, exactly how many local water agencies there are. At least the discrete number is not known. And then we have special districts too. So this is like a picture. I wish it could be a picture, but right now it's words on a bullet point of the water world that we are governed in. Open data has come along and it has its own history. So the water boards have been trying to produce and publish open data sets for a couple of years, but in 2016 there was a statute passed and signed called the Open and Transparent Water Data Act. Probably all of you know about it, but if you don't, there's a lot of information out there on it. It's also called AB 7255. It mandates that the Department of Water Resources, in collaboration with us, Fish and Wildlife, and the Monitoring Council, start doing more publishing of open data, including a platform and actual data sets. So over time, that's coming out. But that's the big hammer of the legislation. The real reason why we do this, though, is it goes back to being transparent, making better decisions, making that data accessible with the premise that that data, getting to that accessibility level, the data becomes alive, and you can start really engaging with all parts of its whole life cycle and system. So this is one of the events that we do to try to do that. It's a data fair. It's fun. We're opening our doors and showing you what you have, and we're taking input. We also do the Civic Engagement Project, and this year it's going to be a safe drinking water theme, which should be really exciting. We're partnering with Government Office of Planning and Research out of the Governor's Office, Department of Water Resources. We're partnering with Western Big Hub Data, who's been gracious enough to sort of provide their expertise. Meredith Lee has run many of these at her previous job at challenge.gov and other places. So we have sort of the A team running a data challenge this time, and it's going to be a lot of fun on a very important topic, maybe not so much mercury related, but just as impactful, and I could just as easily have tears over that one too. So then we sort of zoom down into the ecosystem of the water board. We have over 20 enterprise systems that we call databases. Each one of these has its own purpose and its own history and legacy. They do all sorts of things. Some of them measure and collect data on ambient, like water conditions or effluent conditions. Some of them are just simply facility information, contact information. A lot of our systems, I'll be really honest, are key to our invoicing. And so we went from a general funded organization to a fee funded organization about 8 years ago, I forget. And that transformation really made us be focused on fees and invoicing. And that's not a bad thing. It's actually created a lot of data quality stuff that other agencies don't have, but that's kind of an explainer. That was one of the key moments in our life. So we collect program data, water data, all sorts of stuff in all sorts of places, and we've been trying to publish that out on data.ca.gov platform. That's our open data publishing platform. So I'll explain a little bit about what that means. I've already covered these three purposes, but I'll just say it again. Data-driven management, we make really important decisions sometimes, fish versus people, and then we have a transparency ethic that sort of drives why we do this. Open data is the thing that we focus on because I'll get to the life stage in a minute, but it's machine readable at that point. And we're in an age now where accessibility means you got to have it something that a machine can read. You can't aggregate data. You can't make it super wide because then the machines can't make sense of it without somebody explaining something to them. And so machine readable is important, making it publicly accessible and documenting it for context. And then from there, like magic happens. And we can talk about some of the things that we've seen, but it's going to just get better in the next couple of years. So the other sort of key principle to keep in mind with open data is it's an iterative process. It's like you got to keep coming back and checking yourself and doing something differently. People like that data set, but they would like it more if you added a field that described X or something like that. So you just got to keep doing that. Same with the internal pieces that relate to your data structure. So I'm going to get to that, and I'll also get to why it all matters to the discussion we're about to have. And this is a diagram that I'm going to use for the rest of the day for the most part. This is what we call, and this is just our version of it, the life stages of data in the world we see it. What's missing from that is a stage 0. Stage 0 is really why in the first place, and I'll talk about that. Why are we collecting data? Does the permit say something? And yes, it usually does, and that's the driver. So, but how we collect it, there's all sorts of sub-nuances there. Methods of analysis come into play, discrete versus time series versus batch versus sensitivity, all sorts of like quality issues come up to play right in that stage of collecting the data. Because once you've collected it, that kind of stuff gets essentially locked in. The next stage that we're discretely talking about is storing the data. This is where we go put it, or you go put it in many cases. So these right now are databases that I put in there in sort of cartoon characters. CWIX and CEDN, we could just as easily have SMARTs and ERIMs and other FAST and CIDWIS and you name it. They're all in there, really. But it's that storage layer, and each one of them might have its own characteristics. It might have a relational database structure that's well documented, that's logical and really makes a lot of sense and super flexible. It might be the opposite. It might not be well documented or all, and it might not make any sense, and it might be really hard to work in. Or it might not even be a relational database, and I'll get to one of those. So how you store it sort of affects the life stage and the flow of the data downward on this diagram. The next stage is making it accessible, which is really what I'm focusing on, because if you can get data to that point where it's machine readable, it's publicly accessible, it's well documented, then you can start talking about the rest of the life stages in a much more meaningful way. And then the beauty that happens from there is that you can turn it into information so much easier today. 5, 10 years ago, maybe even today, people are coding things into their databases to provide interpretation. They want to see a map. So they want their program, their application that stores their data to have a mapping feature built into it. So that's not the way that we want to think about this, because that's super inefficient from an administrative purpose. We spend so much time bureaucratically trying to build that thing into that thing. And so what we'd like to do is take advantage of the same technology that allows you to order a lift, that allows you to make a review at Yelp and it goes to the right place. It's the open data approach of having machine readable tabular data flow in a well-structured environment that has the ability to sort of self-correct when there's issues. So that's the magic that can happen, and I have some examples that I'll talk about of that. So the part that's missing, though, is really the stage 0, and I just have this slide that mentions that there's multiple reasons for collecting data. It's not always permits, but people do special studies. We have monitoring programs. You heard about Gamma. We have one called SWAMP in my thing, that's Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. That is one where we spend $10 million approximately a year to go out and collect data. So, there's a real question of, are we getting $10 million worth of data every year when we go out and do SWAMP? And I'm very aware of that, and I make sure that all the people that work on that are having those conversations. So sometimes we collect data for other reasons. Sometimes people collect it just because they're collecting it and they share it. You know, maybe it's programmatic data from some other agency and they're like, sure, you can have it. So like the stage 0 thing is not always critical, but it's something that if you do have control over it, you should think about it. And we'll talk about that with some of the ELAP and some of the other things. So again, looking at it through this window provides a lot of advantages. I'm not going to read that slide. This is one of them. This is a super exciting slide to me. It doesn't look super exciting maybe, but this is a script. This is actually an old screenshot of our GitHub site, but it's the same script essentially. That what this does is it does what I just said. So CEDN has our environmental surface water data. CEDN is California Environmental Data Exchange Network. It's the repository for all the surface water data. It's also been deemed the place to use for listing for impairment purposes. So it's kind of like this big bucket of stuff that's considered very important. So one thing we did is we started piping all that data from CEDN over to our open data publishing site. And we broke it into categories like chemistry, fish tissue, or tissue, toxicity, bioassessment, I think, macroinvertebrates for bioassessment. I forget all the names, but we had categories. And we started making it available and hoping, you know, Field of Dreams, people would use it and love it. And one of the things we found is that the chemistry data in particular, and I think the microbiology data, people want to know the data quality. And we said, well, if there's 18 fields there, you know, can't you make sense of the data quality? It's all these codes in there, and every field describes exactly what happened. You know, we captured it in most cases, not all cases. People are like, no, I don't understand any of your codes, even when you describe them. And so we worked on an algorithm that in the publishing stage, when it takes it from CEDN and puts it over in open data, it adds 2 fields. And the rubric is that it puts the data into a 0 to 5 bucket, depending on how it interprets those codes. And the lines between those 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are open for debate, and this is why we do open work. But when we did that, it puts an integer in that field, and then it puts a description of what led to that integer in the other field. So you now get 2 extra fields in the publication stage. Those 2 fields allow us to do some sorting. I think I have a screenshot of it. So this is a sort of that data. So and this is the chemistry data. So when you start sorting it, sorry, Michelle, I stole I hope you don't mind. You start having amazing conversations about, wait, 80% of our data is of unknown quality or does not meet the data quality objectives. And so you start to have these conversations, and then you start wondering, well, what's driving that? So now we're doing a second dive into some of the things that were triggering whether it fell into category 0, 1, 2, 3, or 5. So these are conversations that we can have now because the data is open. It would be almost impossible to do this if you were hitting a relational database to try to analyze this data. But it's super easy in a way to do this. You know, I don't forget, it probably took half a day or a day to build the data viz, just to start having these conversations. And now we're starting to have the secondary and the tertiary conversations. So that's some of the stuff that happens. Another thing that happens is you can start throwing information together in other ways. So this is a project that we're working on to develop a methodology for machine learning to identify trash. As part of my only mission is to tell stories. And we have a marine and a debris and a litter story to tell in California, but we need to be able to integrate all the different data sets. And one of the things that we rely upon is the landscape, the trash that's on the land. Many of you know there's trash plan amendments out there for people to do stuff. And one of the incentives is to do it the engineered way. And if you don't do it that way, you have to do monitoring. If you do monitoring, there's a method that allows people to do qualitative assessment driving around or walking around. We thought there might be a cheaper, better way to get quantification on that part. So we're trying to work with some partners to develop a machine learning approach that would be an alternative. You could this one sticks a GoPro on a street sweeper and drives around West Sac, and eventually it maps all of West Sac a couple times a year. And the data would be, it's being used to train a brain, and right now it can identify, I think, 15 classes of types of litter, and we could change those classes pretty easily. And then retrain the brain, but then it shows you, this is the output, it shows you the confidence that it thinks it knows what it saw. And so this is a really fun project that we only were able to do because Andrew Hill was a Sea Grant Fellow in our shop last year. But we've taken what he did and learned from it, and we're now doing it ourselves with Alina staff and moving forward with WestSec. They're putting more cameras on their machines. We're trying to find other partners. And eventually what I'd like to do is offer a methodology that says, if you're going to do this kind of visual assessment on the land, here's an alternative. You can still obviously drive around in cars and score it, but this might be another way. This provides so many advantages. And by the way, hotspots, monitoring of effectiveness of intervention programs that a city might have. It solves problems that the city might have that aren't related to compliance with their stormwater permit. So there's a lot of advantages, I think, to sort of thinking this way. And this is something that happens because of open data, especially when you start trying to integrate it with other data to tell a story about what's the trash story in Yolo County, how much trash do we have in the basin. And you start integrating data, you need all this stuff. So much data, yes. More data turning into new data. Yeah. Okay, so this is another example of a tool that takes advantage of some open data techniques. So this is the enforcement tool that David Altair built for my shop with the incentive from the water keepers in San Diego and the statewide alliance had a prototype that basically said we're looking at effluent data from stormwater industrial sites and we want to start making sense of it. So they proposed a rubric that uses a water quality index. It's essentially a way to sort of quickly evaluate how bad a facility is. It looks at both the frequency of exceedances of some number and the magnitude of the exceedances. And you can put the number in. So one of the things that we did is built a feature to allow you to come up with your own sort of criteria that you put into that rubric. That's one way to look at the effluent data. The other way to sort of have this geospatially useful is to put it on a map with other things like disadvantaged communities, impaired water bodies, you name it. All sorts of data layers could go onto a map like this. So this is written in R and displayed in Shiny using the widgets that come with that, our packages. And so this is a product. The URL is there. If everyone hits it today, it's going to shut down for the rest of the month. But it's the end of the month. So hit it today if you can. And then we have a backup site, but email me if you have any problems with that. But it's a fun one to play with. It's interactive. It's got different things. It's got a really well-documented front page and stuff. So that's one example of what happens with open data. We have some other machine learning ones. This ought to be provocative for some of the discussion later today. This is not stuff that we did. This is stuff that's happening around the country, and most of these are University of Chicago. Actually, all these are University of Chicago. So the University of Chicago has a pretty robust data science component, and they have a group that does projects. Sort of, you call them up and you have a project and they say, okay, cool, and if you can pay them, even better. But they were able to work with other people to do predictive analyses using data sets that they had like ours. So the stuff that we call facility information and effluent and compliance information could be fed into something like this and maybe made useful for California. So, for example, they have one that predicts hazardous waste violations. They have one that predicts. They have one for NPDS. I don't see it here, but it's probably in there somewhere. They have one that, it looks at NTS, or maybe it's sanitary overflows. I forget which one it was, but you could do it for both. We actually have a student calling us from UC Berkeley that's trying to do a predictive analysis project for where you might have a lead problem in California for distribution systems within cities and drinking water districts. And they're using a lot of the data that we have, but they're also just building off of things that other people have done, Flint, Michigan, for example, and other places. So the ability to do machine learning, predictive analytics, and other kinds of cool projects is enhanced incredibly by making your data accessible and open. So this is the world that we're trying to flourish and fertilize, so to speak. I'm going to give a couple of quick examples of profiles of our other ecosystems. One is going to be the one we're about to talk about, and I apologize if my slide might have had some negative things, but I'll try to make it more positive when I speak. So the one example, these are polar opposites, and it's not meant to blame anyone, but so we're an organization that has now about 2,000 people. We've got the drinking water program. We've got a bunch of new cannabis people. We're a very dynamic and growing and fast-paced and heavy organization. And so one of the things that happened in the last 5 years was the drought. And when the drought came along, the governor signed an executive order and was looking around for somebody to help enforce some conservation goals and targets. And so the water board was the likely candidate. So Felicia Marcus and our board took on the challenge. and they started from scratch with a program. There was nobody here doing water conservation work that I know of. There was a really lean, like zero program. They assigned one person, and then they needed a data system to start doing the work of the communication of people's actuals versus targets. And so they sort of went for the lean approach, where they said, let's keep this simple. Let's keep it. Not make it a relational database if we don't have to. Let's try to use the information that people are already providing. So they tapped into all these other things, and they started using those numbers. You saw them. They were like, City of X is 23%. Shame on you, City of X. You should be at 25%. So it became part of the dialogue in California, and monthly the board members would meet and talk about it. The press would cover it. Felicia would tweet about it. I would retweet it, and Joaquin would retweet it again. And so there was like 4 tweets right there, and that's sometimes all we ever see. But my point is that it was a very lean, data-driven program. It, even to this day, has like one person, I think, maybe a person and a half that works on it. And it has a database that actually needs a little help because it's still in that sort of stage of we built something quick. But it's still being used to sort of communicate a very important topic that's covered by lots and lots of people. So that's one example of a profile. We also have the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. And that includes, in my mind, stormwater. We're not going to talk about stormwater on the panel today, but if you start looking at the two together, it's about, actually those numbers are old. It's now, what, 50, 60,000? No, 50,000 probably. It's 38 of stormwater alone. How many industrial facilities?
Oh, there's 10,000.
10,000?
And probably about 12,000 data points in this.
Okay, so we got
hundreds of municipal permits.
So we have lots of facilities using our databases. We spent many, many years building our databases, both SMARTS, the Stormwater Multi-Application Reporting and Tracking System. Did I get it? Yes. All right. And then CWIX is the California Integrated Water Quality System. These two databases are cousins. They're built very similar to each other, and they have very similar codes and fields, which helps sort of make sense of the data on the end. But they basically do the same thing of collecting facility kind of tracking compliance information, who the contact is, again, for invoicing purposes largely. But they're large, and they have lots and lots and lots of records in them, and lots of work to sort of get things done on them, and there's maintenance that goes on and what have you. And we have a self-reporting load that's pretty heavy, reflected by those number of facilities. We have a growing number of general permit. How many general enrollees do we have in general NPDES permits? Like the tens of thousands. So on the CWIC side, it's like the number's about the same. So we have, and these are very large systems of collecting information. What we're going to talk about today is how do we get it out? When we get it out, how do we make use of it? How do we make improvements to make use of it? And how do we do this in a more efficient way? We don't really, I hate to sort of sound like a bell ringer, but we don't really have time to sort of wait another 10 years for another database to come along and make more sense of our data that we collected for the last 5 to 10 years. So we have to sort of get smarter, get more efficient today. So with that, I think I'm going to leave you with this slide. Oh, my picture of the Mount Hood didn't come through. Okay, so I'm going to leave this slide up. I'll take any questions about what I said real quick, but then I'm going to convene the panel in a minute. Any questions? In the back?
So when data is collected and checked before it's put in the database, are there any efforts that are made to, if not automate, create some sort of user interface for that process so that the humans that are putting that data in, if they're not collected by sensors, have a limited option of what to choose and they can't screw up because it's A, B, C, or D or not like X, Y, Z? Because I look at data all the time in water where somehow I get this latitude that's like negative 100,021, and it's like, that's just not a latitude. Someone like was asleep at the keyboard and like their head fell down and now there's 6 zeros in there. So
more importantly, can we go check on that person's health? I mean,
yeah. So yeah, my question is more succinctly, what measures or like initiatives do you have to regulate that part of the data flow where it goes from human to computer?
So I mentioned we have 20 enterprise applications that are called databases. I'd say about 8 or 10 of those collect data from external parties, and that's an estimate. And each one of those is a different ecosystem. And each one of those, even within its sort of realm, has different practices for different data flows. So, but we have some best practices, and what my shop is trying to do is to find those best practices that are happening and to share them. It's really hard in an organization like this, especially one that's like very nervous about anyone coming to talk about their database with them. But one example that I have is going back to that SEDEN data set. There's a subcategory in SEDEN that's the SWAMP data, Surface Water Ambient Monitoring Program. It's high quality. It has to have a QAP, and it has checkers. And so literally when you're trying to put it in fact, the whole SEDEN system has checkers. And so if you're putting in a ridiculous number, it'll kick it back. There's other approaches that have more interactive, like, are you sure that's the right number? And there's ones that have no checking whatsoever. It's like you said, somebody could, 5 zeros, oops, my bad, submit, and then it's a record forever until somebody goes and finds it. So, and this is, again, my premise is we have these problems everywhere, and they're overwhelming when you think about them. What we can do, though, is make all of our data that we think is critical accessible. And when it's at that layer, then we can start making decisions about triaging. This is data that we want to look at first. This is the problem, but it's not a problem we need to fix. Okay, you go in the back of the line. We're going to go find the heart attack victims or whatever. So that's the idea of looking at accessibility layers, to daylight the problems and use best practices that we can find that other people are doing. And, gears, like Brent talked about, having to have a quality checker. And so, that's a marriage that's happening because he's talking to the SEDEN people that know a lot about implementing quality checkers. And so that's happening. Other questions?
I almost fell on my chair when you were talking about the trash thing there, Greg, because I was just mentioning to someone this morning, we build trash assessment tools for the Central Coast, and we built mobile apps for people to do just the visual assessments that you described. It's great. They can stream along and do their assessments, but the whole time I'm just thinking, gosh, this seems really silly if you had an AI-based system that could use machine learning to do just what that slide you showed.
Silly. Because you're like 90% of the way there.
It feels silly. So where is that in terms of, like you said, you're seeking additional partners to pilot the program, and I
Talk
suppose.
to me afterwards. So
okay.
One of the things that we need to do is we need to move the brain to a new thing, because as you know, in AI and computer vision, it's a fast-moving thing. So the brain that this was built on, the code, literally, is not the most latest, greatest code. Everyone's moved to a new thing, and so we need to find somebody who can move it, and David's working on that. But that's one of the steps, is to kind of move the brain, the logic of getting all those things to work together, of identifying, tagging, classifying, et cetera. Snipping, I don't even know if that's a thing anymore. But so there's all these things that we're moving over. And then the next stage is to work with people that want to do this in other parts of California. One of the advantages of Street Sweeper versus a thing on a camera driving down a car or a handheld phone is the Street Sweepers have mandated parking restrictions. So you have a less chance of somebody blocking the view of the curb. So that was, one of the sort of win-wins that we got out of that. You'll still be able to quantify if there's cars parked, but you maybe won't see as much. And so those are the kinds of things we'd love to talk to you. We'd love to partner with more. We're trying to meet with Caltrans to talk about, I guess they're doing a very similar thing within Caltrans of a machine learning project to look at roadside debris, which makes sense. If we can do it, anyone can do it. Any other questions?
I forgot the internet people. You guys have a GitHub repository of some of your projects and stuff. Is that all of the water board's items, or just the SEDEN folks that contribute to that?
We're trying to find all we're a great organization because we're extremely creative and people solve their own problems and they just don't want to advertise them. But we're trying to make them feel safe, and so we're collecting up the people we can find. And we're actually trying to build that structure I was talking about, of having some of the stuff be behind password protection and some of the stuff being public. And we're experimenting. GovOps is actually, if you're another state agency, which you are, GovOps has a license, and they're willing to sort of give you some repo control, admin control that might be functional for another state agency. without having to buy your own GitHub. So that's what we're trying to do is find them and then collect them and make them feel like it's a safe place. But we got water rights people in there, a couple of people from my shop. David, who else do we have? Anyone? ORPP, yeah.
The reason I ask is that maybe 5 years ago, the California State Government GIS User Group created a GitHub, like kind of land for other people's GitHubs, and so I'll have to. I passed the.
That's the same group we're coordinating with. It's Scott Gregory's group. It's the California Department of Technology owns the GitHub license that we're trying to coordinate with, which would be, I think, ideal, is to have all state California agencies sort of located in one directory area.
Sounds like a good family approach.
Yeah.
Sometimes the family comes in. Are you accepting
or are you accepting contributions from the private sector for code?
Yeah, so we don't have an acceptance process. I think we would fork or something like that probably and say, if you want to know more about this topic. I think what we want to do, we want to be transparent about what we're doing. And so that's one of the main reasons I said put it on GitHub, because I know people are running scripts.
Yeah.
But if somebody says, I want to see the algorithm, especially if we get into this predictive stuff on enforcement or something like that, I want to be transparent. We all want to be transparent.
Right, exactly.
So that's kind of the main purpose, is for us to have a place to make it transparent and to archive it over time.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because, if we're all building these other tools, it's kind of sad sometimes because we'll put them on our GitHubs and no one will ever find them. And then either you repeat the work or, whatever it might be. And that's why usually people either will kind of make a master repo list somewhere that includes all the other people that are working with the software, or else a forking model, or actually take those contributions and accept them into the public domain or something.
Okay, well, I was faking it on half of what I just said a minute ago. So you're going to have to talk to David to figure out exactly how to do this.
Great. Could you connect me later? Yeah. By the way. Yeah, no, okay. Sorry, Greg.
No, it's good. Okay. Unless there's any other really urgent things, I'm going to introduce my panelists. So we have a panel to talk about NPDS, and we're going to talk about this data lifecycle. We're going to talk about different perspectives on it, how people use data, how they have interest, and what we can do with our tweaking of the data lifecycle to address those interests. So I will introduce the panelists. So first, since she's not part of a hug right now, Christine Sotelo. Christine Sotelo works at the Water Board and has worked here many, many months. Sorry, I won't, yeah. And I've known Christine since the stormwater program when we were both out there trying to find discharges that were not doing things right, and she's now in charge of the whole ELAP program and the drinking water, and she's taken it from something that was not what it used to, not what it is, not what it should be, to something that's amazing and works now, and that's incredible work that's being done with that. And so the ELAP program, for your perspective, is the lab, environmental laboratory. I'll let you explain it. Okay, so Christine Sotelo, thank you for coming. Next, I'll introduce, because he's walking up here, Danny McClure. Danny McClure works at the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board. He is, what is your title? He's a senior engineer. He has long history with TMDLs and pesticides, and he's a consumer of data in the sense that he's trying to solve water quality problems with a device that doesn't generate its own data. It relies on other organizations. So I've asked him to be here to talk about how does the Water Board regulatory program, part of the ecosystem that doesn't have its own sort of generating of data, how does it consume data? What does it desire? What kind of needs does it have? So thank you for joining us today. Fellow Humboldt grad, by the way. Lumberjacks. And next, Richard McHenry. Richard McHenry is now with Cal Sport Fishing Alliance, I believe, or maybe he's just with himself, but his prior career was that he was with the water boards for many years, including State Board for a period of time. Richard is an expert on NPDS programs, wastewater. He is a continued expert. I know people to this day that still probably reach out to you and ask you questions because you're such a valuable resource to the organization, and he's nice enough to join us on Friday. Thank you, Richard, for joining.
My pleasure.
And then the last panelist is Diana Messina. Diana is supervising water resource control engineer. My prior supervisor. It's good to have her here. She is the Division of Water Quality's lead person on the NPDES program, which also covers the stormwater program. She has a history of working at the regional board, the state board, Division of Financial Assistance. I forget all the other. I think you were consulting for a while too. And so she's got a vast experience of knowledge about the program on many sides. I've also asked her to represent the discharger side because we had a panelist, Phil Boble, who couldn't make it today from the city of Palo Alto. And so Diana is pinch hitting for the POTW as well as wearing the regulatory hat. So thank you for joining us, Diana. What's that? Are you volunteering yourself? Okay. Well, this should be interactive, so there'll be a point where I may ask for your perspective. So, and anyone else's. I mean, this is really meant to be, like I said, we're exploring this together. And the idea, again, is to try to learn about the data flow. I failed on one thing. I was going to have a map. I was going to have a map of the data. So, like, I was going to basically say data starts its life here in some, twinkle of an eye of a permit, and then it comes its way down into here, and it shows up here, and in some cases it goes over there, sits there, and then becomes accessible there. Imagine a map. We'll kind of use this to try to make the map. But that is one of the goals maybe, is to shine a light around this cave enough so that we can make a really good map at the end of the day. And one of the things about the map is that we can talk about things like, is that a database fix? To fix that problem, is that a database fix or is that a data collection? Is there another method that we could use or things like that? So keep that sort of spirit in mind. We are going to talk about some things that are also regulatory in nature. So I've asked my panelists to each give a 1 to 2 minute explanation of the relationship to this data ecosystem. And, I want to also thank Afruz and Carl for your help to make this project happen. And I know that it was hard to understand this, and I know that you cringe every time I say data ecosystem. Sorry. But thank you very much for your help to get it to this point, and including some of the questions that I'll use. And then Jarma and Eric Mogg and others helped too. But anyway, I want to thank the whole team that sort of helped get to this point. So with that, I'll start with 1 to 2 minutes each, starting on this side with Christine, please.
All right. So thank you, everybody, for inviting ELAP to come be part of this. This is just a small part of all the regulatory agencies that we generate data for. So as Greg mentioned, I'm the chief of the program, California's Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Program, and we are the largest accreditation program in the United States. We regulate 700 laboratories for different matrices, so wastewater, drinking water, hazardous waste. We also dip into some public health, the shellfish regulation, and our mission is to ensure that the labs that generate data for these state agencies are known and documented quality. And the vision that we worked with all of our state agency partners, and we have a committee that helped us put together this vision, is that we generate the highest quality data for your environmental decision making. So if you look at that map, Greg, is right. There is a stage 0, but we're kind of stage 0. We're like the origin and the genesis of all the data that you guys use to make your decisions. And to answer the question of where, we are in this ecosystem of data is that, we really need to be interacting with the labs that we regulate need to be interacting with the dischargers who are complying with the permits that you all write. And so they need to be having decisions about what the data quality objectives are, what methods to use. There are different types of methods that are used for different intended purposes. And so that conversation has to be had with the laboratory that is generating the data for the discharges that you regulate. So that's really where we connect into the ecosystem of data for NPDES.
So when that data arrives in a database and shows up, and somebody wants to know about the quality of the laboratory work that was done to generate that data, you have multiple points of interaction is what you're saying.
Absolutely, yeah. The format and convention that they use, we could tighten that up for sure. We can ensure that there's historical recreation of all of the quality assurance, quality control information, all of that from the very beginning of when it actually enters into that stage 1.
Cool. Thank you. Danny?
So just so I don't bore everybody, does everyone have a general familiarity with the TMDL program and what it is, or show of hands if you do, maybe? Okay, good. I won't bore anybody then. So yeah, working in the TMDL program, we create.
You might explain the acronym because I didn't do that either. It's my fault.
Okay, yeah. So that's a total maximum daily loads, and so it's basically a program for standards attainment for water bodies that aren't attaining standards, and we distribute the allocations to the dischargers to a certain water body that's not attaining standards. I guess I can't help explaining what the program is. But so the tie into that, at the TMDL program, we have a few responsibilities. One is maintaining the 303D list, which is part of the integrated report, which is a big effort actually turning data into information where we take all the data out there, and that's all in CalWACA, which is kind of one of those, they call it a database, but I think you'd call it an enterprise application or
a code. It's scripted too, yeah.
So and then that is now using seed and environmental data. So we take all that data and determine whether we're meeting standards, and then including data from MPS facilities. And then for the water bodies aren't attaining standards, we need to develop TMDLs. So one things we look at is what's coming out of wastewater treatment plants, other MPS facilities, and then what's in the receiving water to determine. So, we're looking at how far off we are from the standards, what kind of reductions are needed, and what's feasible to help our board decide how to slice up the pie when we're developing that TMDL. The other thing, our other involvement is kind of at phase 0, especially for things like new pollutants, such as pesticides, where the methods are still in development to get the detection limits we need. And so we put requirements in our TMDLs and our basin plan amendments for monitoring and work with labs, ELAP, and others to make sure that we have data of known quality. And so that's always kind of a push and pull because we want data and information as soon as possible, whether there's other people are nervous about what we're going to do with it. And then we also work with the NPDES data once we have something in the basin plan, a TMDL, to work with NPDES staff to see how people are doing it, meeting the allocations and whether adjustments are needed. So usually the NPDES staff will be a primary point of contact for the dischargers, but we assist them in that. So that's our kind of interaction with the NPDES data ecosystem for our program, from my perspective.
Thank you, Danny. Richard?
I'm Richard McHenry, and actually I started at the water boards long before anybody had computers on their desks or anywhere else in the office, and probably before a lot of you were born. And I have crunched thousands of discharger monitoring reports over the years, a lot of them by hand, before we had any ability to do computer-generated statistics and those sorts of things. So a lot of old school stuff. Most of my time, 25 years at the water boards, was in the NPDES program. I did wastewater treatment plant inspection training for US EPA, developed an expertise in industrial pretreatment, and had a lot of experience in the field and writing permits and doing enforcement. My last year and a half, I came down to the state board. They had created a position for me as a senior specialist in the Office of Enforcement, and so I got to work more on a statewide basis. I take great pride that after I retired, I became Diana's biggest headache in working
on the job.
We keep her professional and hopefully still have a good time. But I joined with California Sports Fishing Protection Alliance. We do permit reviews, a lot of petitions, stormwater enforcement, FSO enforcement, a lot of things like that. We're huge advocates of doing good science and using all data. We rely on ELAP's expertise in maintaining good QA/QC in laboratories, and we rely on that and feel that, you shouldn't be throwing data out unless there's a true problem with it. And appreciate all the great work that's done by ELAP to make sure that we do have good, reliable data. So we're always looking in the databases. A lot of frustration from our end in doing that, just trying to figure out what it is. So we always have a lot of questions for staff who we always appreciate the help.
Thank you. Diana?
Great. Thank you. I'm Diana Messina. I actually joined the state board when I and Darren Polhemus had to share a computer in a common room until maybe 6 months later we each had computers on our own desk using WordPerfect. So through the years, I had the pleasure to work for the State Water Board in different divisions for different programs. One of my greatest pleasures was working on the team that established the statewide state implementation plan, which implemented the California Toxic Rule. Then my next best pleasure was going to the Central Valley Water Board, where I had to implement the policy that I wrote. And as I backfilled Richard McHenry's position, backfilling big shoes, and I have to tell you, just the combination of experience from being at the state board to the regional board and now back at the state board, I have a kind of a big picture of where NPDES permitting and the data ecosystem or eco-world kind of come together. First of all, NPDES stands for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. This federal permitting program is delegated from the federal government to California. That E in NPDES means elimination of pollutants. We are, as staff, I think on a daily basis, I always tell my staff that our job in permitting is to take forth information and come up with recommendations for our water boards to make decisions. When it comes to permitting, the decisions that have to be made are based on the information we bring forth, and it is how much discharge of pollutants can our boards permit to go in a receiving water, which means we use data to identify how much assimilative capacity is in those receiving waters, which means how much can that receiving water, how much of that pollutant can that receiving water gain. We always have to remind ourselves as staff that our job isn't to write permits. Overall, the water board's job is to protect beneficial uses. And so when we look at it that way, we see that our water quality Bibles, which are our basin plans and our statewide policies and so forth, they set forth the thresholds of how our beneficial uses are protected. And we can only protect our beneficial uses as well as we can write effective permits. And data is what we depend on and what our board members depend on as we come forward with our recommendations. We are very fortunate in California that we're the leading edge, that our beneficial uses now no longer just apply to our receiving waters. They apply to our NPDES discharges as we get closer and closer to flange for drinking water, because our discharges are the source water. We get closer to putting our beneficial uses on stormwater capture as we are going down the road of using stormwater as a water supply. The same thing with our highly treated tertiary municipal discharges. Now that is part of our water supply as recycled water. So as we do this, we see the world of data as the data that our planning and TMDL folks use is the same data that we use and collect for our permits, which is really the same data that other programs like drinking water needs to use. And so as we get closer and closer for all the data to be in the same language, I think our world of data and information is truly going to be synergistic, right, Christine? So that's my 2 minutes for the NPDES. Do I have 2 minutes for the dischargers too? Or do you want me to stop there?
You have 1 minute.
1 minute for the dischargers. Okay.
2 minutes, it sounds
so
like.
No, it'll be 30 seconds. So I am a discharger. As a discharger, I am putting a lot of transparency onto my agency as I put my data forth in public and as I submit it to the agencies. And so there is a lot of accountability that falls on those agencies. As a discharger, when I make a 180-degree turn, I have a lot of accountability on my ratepayers, that the rates stay within the financial capacity of the agency and within the affordability of the ratepayers. So as a discharger, I really rely that data that is public is a good reflection on our agency.
That's a great segue to thank you, to where I was going to go. So I'm going to be a little bit provocative as the moderator and say, we don't have time to do permits the way that we used to. We take many, many years sometimes to reissue a permit, and we often go through a multi-year process in that reissuance, and we're kind of taking the old and just making it new, right? Part of that formula, and you all sort of touched on it, is in the stage 0 life stage. There's a reason why we're looking at copper. I'll just use copper. I touched on mercury earlier. There's a reason why we're asking dischargers to look at copper and analyze it in their effluent and analyze it with certain sensitivity, right, so that we get data that's useful. There's another piece that comes along and says this is the level that's needed to protect. It's kind of data in a way because it relates to this whole ecosystem. Put those together, and by the way, some of those studies that I know about for copper may have been done in the 60s, and nobody's really updated some of those numbers. They were done for national ambient water quality work, and EPA used to do all that. They don't do it anymore. So that whole thing then starts to drive a thing that costs money. You're also lead on cost of compliance, and this is part of the message that I heard you say, is this costs money. At the end of the day, somebody doing all this work to analyze copper once a week, once a day, do all the mechanics of calculating, that's driving something. So if that's that little copper relationship system that I just described, if we can see that in your heads, what do we do first? Do we update the numbers to make them more appropriate for protective interests for beneficial uses? Do we tighten down the efficiency on the analytical side? Do we go back and revisit even the question of, is copper a part of our beneficial use equation, and how do we do that? So who wants to dive into that? Where do we get the most bang for the buck? If at the end of the day we're just talking about money, maybe. Let's just make it simple.
Looking at the amount of money people spend on building wastewater treatment plants relative to the small amount of money that it could take to, kill some fish in a lab to see what the limit is. I think a lot of money on. I think there often it's a good use of money to really look at the toxicity and look at fine tuning the standards. Our board has done that a lot, and because things like the bioavailability of copper can make the difference between whether someone needs to upgrade or not. And so it's often money well spent, I think, and it's kind of surprising that more isn't.
So in the life stage, what you're talking about is you're answering the same management question, but you're using a different method. Like toxicity is one way to sort of screen out. Or were you suggesting that you don't? Well, I don't know. I was trying to understand. Is that a method option? Like, are you saying maybe use a different method to sort of address the beneficial use question, or tighten up the copper method and make it more cost-effective? Bioavailable copper, for example.
Yeah, not so much the analysis method, but the criteria themselves.
Oh, I see. Which changes that relationship of numbers and analytical methods. Because it's a different standard in the permit or a different criteria in the permit.
Right, and then that, can kind of drive your data collection too if you are accounting for different other things in the water that affect the bioavailability, then you need to gather that the right way.
And to kind of talk that through there, so then they would make that decision, right? They'd put it in a permit, put it in their basin plan, and then it would be required by any one of these dischargers that are listening or out there in California, and they would have to find a accredited laboratory, right? And depending on what level they're looking for, there could be a method or not. And when I say or not, it could be approved method. It could be some laboratory developed method that is like something that they just developed that has not been approved by, one of those standard method consensus bodies or even EPA. ELAP can help the agency partners to accredit those methods. It doesn't have to be something that is approved, because when you're running a method, there is actual steps to follow, and there are professional standards that you follow in the method. And that's what we're looking at. So whether it's approved or not by US EPA or a consensus body, ELAP can come in and do that. And then what we do in the laboratory is we make sure that whatever they want in their permit requirements, that we make sure that that laboratory has a method that can achieve it. And that's, if you heard me say the term intended use, that is the choice of the method.
Yeah, I think I'm fascinated by that because we do a lot of work in my shop on emerging contaminants, and that's a space where we're just going to have to get better and more flexible at using your vehicle to have conversations about new methods and get people's comfort with what it means to use a new method. But I wanted to check in and see if anyone wanted to go back to the copper example and say, Richard?
Yeah.
Not an emerging contaminant, by the way.
No.
Copper's been around a while.
Copper's not only been around a while, but it's one of the most toxic constituents that we have.
It kills well, too,
Yeah, it kills extremely well, and that's why it's widely used. A CTR constituent, which was, full compliance was required in 2000, I think, or 2010. So, we're a little bit behind the curve. Wastewater treatment plants generally are not designed to remove heavy metals and toxic metals. And so any removal through a wastewater treatment system is just because you're removing solids, you're removing some metals as well. So if they're dissolved metals, you likely not touching them, and they're all just passing through. But copper's interesting. It's a hardness-dependent metal. And it was CTR constituent, as I mentioned, but US EPA has indeed updated the standard and come out with new ambient water quality criteria. EPA and Fish and Wildlife Service, in development of the CTR, said hardness is not that great of a driver in determining the bioavailability of these toxic metals. What you really need are like 9 to 11 different input parameters into an equation so that you can figure out what's truly bioavailable to aquatic life. And so it was a mandate in the biological opinion for the CTR that they develop toxic metal standards based on this formula. They have done copper. It's the only one they've done so far. But they've got that done. But it's out there. And, one of the issues is nobody's doing much sampling for those 9 input parameters. So we're behind the curve a little bit in using it. And, there's obviously debate about do you stick with the CTR criteria or the new ambient water quality criteria. But if we're not doing the sampling now, we're going to be another 5 years behind the curve once we do start using the newer methodology because we don't have that data available. And I think we talked yesterday a little bit about, the availability of data and staying ahead of the curve opposed to falling behind. And that's a good example of where that happens.
Yeah. Diana?
I have a very quick follow-up. I am not a fan of thinking to adjust criteria because we all know how expensive and time-consuming it is to develop a new criteria and actually get it adopted. I'm going to build on what Richard just said in that I believe we have good science when it comes to copper. I also believe that our California waters are unique with the other different parameters that goes into that equation compared to waters throughout the state. And US EPA did come out with a water effect ratio guideline for copper, and there's other studies. I think we need to just continue building on the existing equation and start plugging in the important parameters specifically for California. That in itself will save the expensive process of basin plan amendments and other statewide plans, yet be much more effective for our discharges. Lastly, I do believe copper is one of those elements that source control and pollution prevention should be thoroughly exhausted before you spend the money on treatment, because treatment is extremely expensive.
You know, it's interesting, and this is why Diana and I have lengthy discussions.
Let's
but
do it.
in terms of source control, you know, most of the source of copper is from copper pipes. And, you know, to go into people's homes and remove their copper pipes and replace them with plastic or whatever, it's not going to happen. You know, it's just not really feasible. You know, I think we can take a look at Flint and replacing their, you know, water distribution system and, you know, how fast that's happening. You know, there's a lot of other uses where source control is excellent. You know, golf courses use copper in their ponds to make it nice and blue and keep the algae dead, and then they just discharge it to surface waters. And not to jump on golf courses, it's just one that I've seen frequently.
So what I'm hearing is that the conversation about what's the right intervention strategy might be informed by different data sets coming.
Well, I think there's a lot of room to do
what
Diana suggests.
Yeah.
And she's absolutely right.
In some cases, it may be the right thing to do is to do source control. In other cases, it may be a different approach.
Treatment for a lot of these heavy metals is probably reverse osmosis, and that elicits a knee-jerk response right away. A lot of people get sore chins.
The other data component that I'm hearing in this conversation is one of the premises for establishing the new copper rule, quote unquote, was this idea that it would be married with new data that would be collected also to sort of inform, and that's not happening. So or maybe it's happening, but we just don't know it. So there's a data component there too of going back to evaluate some of the assumptions that went into the copper decision about hardness effects by bringing in data sets or collecting new data to inform it.
Great. One last thing.
Yeah.
Let's not forget our new watershed approach in that we shouldn't have so much focus on ratcheting down the discharges that we know we can control and forget where the copper is coming from in other discharges throughout the watershed.
Which I think there's a big data component there too of integrating data sets that don't just live in one program area, right? And so making better watershed data dives is actually something that's near to my heart in the profession, but also in the office, like in my shop. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that in the future if we can focus on that accessibility layer of data.
And I just would add, you know, one last thing on copper, and that is EPA and all of the people that have developed the criteria, they don't know where it's going to come out. Their statement in the criteria is, in some instances, it's going to be more restrictive, in some others, it's going to be less restrictive. And, you know, so I think that falls in line with what Diana is proposing in site-specific. I think site-specific using the new criteria is going to be more tied into that specific location than what we have only based on hardness.
So we had a request from the audience to speak, and it's from a POCW. So can I actually get a second microphone? I'll just leave this one roaming around.
My name is Nicole Sears. I'm with Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District, and wanted to I don't have too much to say about copper, except, and I actually lost what I had to say about copper. I have a burning question, though, when there's time about.
Is it a data-focused?
Absolutely, a data-focused question. We were this year we've been submitting our DMRs, our monthly monitoring reports, to CWICS for a long time. But this year we were asked to submit our effluent characterization study and our pretreatment program data as well, which I thought was a really excellent change. I was blown away. I was really shocked that we weren't doing it up to that point. But I guess we waited until we were told to, and so that's what we did. This year was our first time submitting. And what that opened, so it does relate back to copper. What happened is several of these reports that we submit, that the full data sets went in, include the same data. So rather than getting your 3 days a month of copper this year, there'll be probably 4. Those same data points were submitted 4 times for different reports. And when the public can go in and pull from CWICS, it's an open-ended query, you get everything. And the column that shows you that this is duplicative data is all the way, it's like way over to the right. You don't see it very easily. And I'm wondering what the state's planning to do, or how to address that in a way that's.
Great question for me. We've had all sorts of experience trying to make CWICS data structured and be rational. And one of the things that we do is publish flat file outputs. And so on data.co.gov, what we'd like to do is have the data flow to that point, and you could obviously still go to the CWICS page and download data. As a power user, you need to know that may be duplicative data. But on the publish side, what we'd like to do is to filter out duplications or make sense of things that otherwise need to be made sense of. So the goal is to put the data on the published website, data.co.gov, and not have people have to go make sense of it themselves.
But CWICS will always be a public platform, a way for people to get the data out.
So, real quick commentary on a lot of our databases is they're built for business process primarily, and then they store data as a sort of a side thing. And one of the artifacts of that is that you end up with a lot of relations that they may make sense for the business purpose. Like you can see the facility, how many inspections were done, or when the last one was done maybe, but you don't know that the same person counted that inspection for also a landfill, and then it shows up in 2 places as the same inspection. So those kinds of artifacts we have to work through. Are there any other comments on the copper data ecosystem?
I had one actually.
Oh, yeah.
If I could jump in, since you're talking about, we've got all these programmers out here developing tools and such. One thing that would be really helpful is tools for that could help automate some of the processes of determining the bioavailable fraction and also additivity, because that could really improve our understanding of what the data means to the aquatic life or other beneficial uses.
That's a great idea. And again, it's probably something that's coded by somebody else somewhere anyway, and we would just borrow it and make it ours.
Email it to me, please.
Actually, I'll try to remember. Is someone taking notes of some of these things? I hope somebody on my staff. If not, can you try to take? Oh, good. It's being recorded. Okay, so let's move down in the life cycle. So we talked about sort of that collection, some of the things that go into thinking about when a permit is driving the collection of the data. And we'll go back to this. Don't worry. This is the whole beauty of this, is you actually see a problem later that makes you go back and say, that's an ELAP thing. Okay, so where the data goes, right now we have sort of a single path for NPDS for the most part. We're talking about traditional NPDS, so it's all going into CWICS for the most part. There is a question, though, of if the data goes into CWICS and it comes from a PHW that's doing effluent and receiving water monitoring, and that receiving water is in sort of this space that we also call ambient, does that data flow out, and where does it go? And how do you guys relate to that question? Danny, do you want to go first on that one?
Well, from the side of using that data for our ambient water quality assessment in the integrated report and 303D list update, it would be more likely to get
incorporated into our overall assessment of standards attainment if it was moved to CEDN, because that, by our listing policy is where we look, and it's our definition of readily available. It's good that it's made the improvements it has recently to, become more usable. And there is, a lot of it still will end up being used. And it's not necessarily associated with a facility that happened to capture it.
So Dharma will kick me because I didn't do this, but there should be a arrow, because there is some crosswalking, and that's really what's happening is sometimes dischargers submit their receiving water data to CWICS, and it flows over to the CEDN side. We also have flows going out of, you actually see some of that over here, but some of these CEDN and other data sets flow to EPA's Water Quality Exchange and becomes available on their data sets or in their data sets. So this adding arrows and making flows is expensive. So again, do any dischargers in the room submit their data directly to CEDN? I'm just curious to make sure that gets in there. I think that could be both considered a thing that they would want to do in some cases and a thing that they wouldn't want to do in other cases.
Yeah, we've had when they're interested in getting something delisted, they've definitely uploaded some data.
I have a comment.
Diana?
Yes, about the separation of receiving water monitoring data from the data that's required of an NPDES permit. That receiving water data goes into CWICS, and then data from our swamp programs and other data goes into CEDN. And in writing permits throughout the regions, there is this issue that when we do the reasonable potential analysis for an NPDES permit, which we have to compare what's in the discharge to what is in the receiving water, the data sets aren't complete. And so some regions will only use the receiving water data from the dischargers. Other regions will use all ambient data available, and it's almost what Danny just said. It depends which one gives the answer that is wanted overall. So I believe that the next step of getting all ambient data into either one database or the databases being able to talk to each other and all being consistent quality data will allow us to really paint a consistent picture on not only the health of our surface waters, but also the evaluation of how much pollutants our boards can continue allowing to be discharged.
So is there a bright line in your mind, anyone's mind, of when receiving water data that's being required through a permit to be collected is clearly not ambient, like it's too close to the outfall, or is there a bright line of, or is there a gray area? Like it's either clearly ambient because it's so far disconnected from any outfall impact or influence that it's truly receiving water. This is one of the questions that just pops up into my head when you're talking.
And that shouldn't be an issue. And really where that comes up for the most part is in priority pollutant sampling, which she just mentioned and brought up. And, I think I recommended probably to Christine over a decade ago that it's like, can't we get that receiving water data that the dischargers into the other databases? It seems like such a good source of stuff for the 303D listings and those sorts of things. But I've never seen it really be an issue as far as the mixing with the effluent and the receiving stream. It's good, reliable data for the most part. If I have any problem with it, and, this goes back to money again, is, there's just not enough of it usually to be statistically significant. Even the student t-test usually requires at least 13 data points. In the life of a permit, we're not getting that typically. And, it's not the best science when you come to evaluating the data to see that it truly is, log normally fitting on a curve those sorts of things don't work if you don't have enough data points.
So, Danny, is regional monitoring the answer then?
It could be part of the answer, I think, definitely. I mean, instead of each, and, so the concept that instead of just everyone just monitoring at their outfall, people pool their resources together, and we could get a little bit of a better characterization. That's, what a lot of regions have gone to for their receiving water monitoring. And actually for our region's Delta monitoring program, it's also helped with the data availability because all that receiving water monitoring is getting uploaded into SEDEN. And we're able to do more in terms of more parameters too. And I think it, to some degree, takes away from the nervousness about a hesitation to generate data that could get used against them because they're monitoring a little bit further away where it's kind of the net effect. So it can help, generate more statistically robust data sets.
If I could comment on the original question about CWICs and if ambient monitoring had been or imported into SEDEN, and recently I've forgotten a large historical data set that we collected was put into SEDEN, and I think SFEI helped to coordinate it, but also something I thought was great.
I'm personally not a fan of creating more power of silos, right? But the board has determined that SEDEN is our place that we use for policy, for listing policy. So, but what I'd rather focus on is accessibility of data. It just makes more sense to me in my current job. But that said, we do need to figure out a way to make the data accessible either way, if it flows to SEDEN or just becomes accessible. And we've actually worked on some ways to try to balance that and sort of do both, not the rubric that it requires to go through the loaders and checkers, just make it accessible. So, okay. Diana? Yeah.
I'm going to put my discharger hat on.
Please.
And for me as a discharger, it's very important that I monitor upstream as well as downstream of my outfall. So I have clear information on where I'm responsible for the downstream concentration. But also when you ask which data, should there be data by the banks versus by drinking water intake, it depends if you ask the fish that are spawning along the banks or if you ask the Southern California drinking water agencies that after everything is mixed, there's the issue. So unless a permit allows for a mixing zone, per federal regulations, we protect the receiving water at the outfall once it goes into the receiving water, the surface water.
You're really illustrating perfectly this idea that management questions compete with each other sometimes, even though they don't act like they do. And the monitoring has to try to sort of make friends with all these different sort of management questions that are coming up, or find the compromise is another way to put it. But that's a really good point. Again, I hope that accessibility provides a way to sort of have those conversations. Like, we can look at that data, but it's all built for this other management question. It's not really going to be the right data set to answer your question. You can use it, but or you don't have a statistical significance needed to answer the question that you're actually asking. So that's again part of this idea. So emerging contaminants. One of the things that we face as an organization, society, and a program is this leading edge that's always going to be some things coming into it that need new methods. So Christine, how do we deal with the fact that there's new methods to both look at the bioeffects of groups of contaminants without knowing who they are or what they are, and then this targeted chemistry thing that at some point we're going to know what the thing is we're looking for, but there's no regulatory driver for it. And there may not be a method that is on an approved list, or the labs are not available, quote unquote. So how do we deal with that from an ELAB perspective?
So we leave the door open, right? We don't shut the door for accreditation. Everyone seems to think, or the misconception is that ELAP accreditation is only for compliance purposes, but it's not. I mean, where we come in is we just ensure professional standards in a laboratory. So again, if you want to run a method that is some exotic, very unique thing that you tweaked an instrument to get down really low and it's not been approved, you know, I think that it behooves the regulatory agencies to use it because you're trying to push to protect water quality, and just because there isn't a method on the shelf to pull from doesn't mean that you shouldn't be going in there and trying to use that method or regulate it. You just have to make sure that it's not a lab in a garage, you know, or somebody that doesn't know what they're doing. They just follow standards. So we're all about come bring the methods. We will accredit them, whatever it is. There's a framework for doing that. You know, the Central Valley Water Board is looking at pyrethroids. There's a US EPA method that doesn't get down to the detection level that they want, and we're saying we can help you out. So that's our perspective. And I think, you know, just being here today, part of this data fair, just to get that message out that, you know, we don't live in this box of just approved methods, and we like innovation. We like, you know, the water boards to keep trying to detect all of those things to protect public health and the environment. So that's our position at ELAP.
Any other feedback, thoughts on CECs?
Well, there are quite a few methods that have been approved and are acceptable these days. We're not only talking about water column chemistry, but we're also talking about the impacts to aquatic life that should be monitored as well. You know, you've got a lot of information about fish changing species and so on and so forth, you know, which is outside that chemistry box.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of other impacts. A good friend of mine, another engineer, one thing that's, you know, been of concern is, you know, things like wastewater leaching through pond levees into surface waters and sampling for that, you know, finding that a defensible analysis for enforcement to make that stop. And he said, caffeine. You know, that's how you show it's wastewater, and it's like everywhere.
Yeah, there's a suite of human indicators that can be looked at that are known that you can look for.
Yeah.
The bioanalytical techniques that we're trying to develop with partners are showing promise, but they're not ready to be, I think, run through an ELAP process, or some of them may and some may not be, some assays. The question that I have, though, is what is the data? So here's another example. How many people have heard of the eDNA efforts in looking at delta smelt and things like that, right? So, you know, we had a meeting with some eDNA folks, and I was like, what does your data look like? At the end of the day, what is it? How do we make sense of it? Because it's going to be a different thing than a copper units of measure, you know. And so these are questions, and then how do you make sense of that? How do you integrate the results of a series of bioassays that showed estrogenic effects on 80% of the whatever cells measured? How does that relate back? I know that we have experience with toxicity, but do you guys have any thoughts on how we want to structure data if we're going to be collecting these sort of new types of measures of old management questions?
Well, I'm not sure how you enter that into a database, that's for sure.
They do, though. I asked them. They showed me. It didn't make sense to me, but yeah.
I have that same problem with making sense, but, you know, I took that sort of a step further in, you know, looking at this, because there is a lot of data showing impacts, and, you know, some of it's broad, and it says every single treatment plant that we looked at causes this or causes that. So, you know, under the federal NPDES regulations, it's not just a clear violation, but a threat of a violation, you know, can also be cause for enforcement. And, you know, are these effects causing in-stream toxicity and, you know, impacting, you know, sublethal impacts of aquatic life? And, you know, is that a threatened violation of a permit? And the only reason we were going down that road is to try to get some sampling done, to get that ball rolling so that we knew, you know, I'm always worried there's no data on this, there's no data, we need a report, you know, we need a study. And so 5 years later, the study wasn't good and we need another study. And, you know, we're always chasing that. And so trying to get ahead of the curve, but I don't know how to read it yet.
Christine, do you know if the ELAP process, would it if it said, here's a method, would it get into the level of talking about how the data is structured?
No.
No.
Yeah, I think that's a gap, for sure.
Which is where I think my shop and others can help, because, our job is to make sure that you're collecting something that's useful.
We only have one, agency that requires reporting format. I guess that's what you're getting at is Division of Drinking Water. And that is mirrored regulations for ELAP and for Division of Drinking Water. So when we go into the lab, we ensure they're following the method. We check to see that they're uploading and formatting the data as they wish. And so a wish list for mine is for all of the agency partners to come and
tell us your format.
Tell us your format, same convention,
Hear that out there, permit writers?
Yeah. So that, and then we have regulations to help back you up, so we have your back when we're in a laboratory and we check to see, okay, this is some wastewater matrix, and who are you reporting right, and is the right format? Because we watch DDW's back, but not all the agencies that we credit methods for.
Interesting.
But that's a huge regulatory fix that has to be done, and all the agencies have to partner together and work with us. So.
Diana first, and then Richard.
Yeah. So for those of you that know me, you'd know I understood only 40% of all those acronyms that were just said. So I'm not a big data guru. But I do have to say, Greg, you're very good at always looking at the big picture and saying, what are the questions we need answered? And in working with Christine and the NPDES program, water quality assurance program, data quality assurance program, and so forth, I believe it behooves us to really think of the questions we need answered and then place the requirements in the permit and allow the labs to further develop these processes and methods that are needed to answer these questions. We saw that back in 2000 when the CTR was promulgated, and then we implemented them in NPDES permits. And a survey was done of California labs, and not very many labs could do the necessary analysis. However, because the requirements went in permits, that opened up the market for laboratories in California. So I guess what I'm saying is, what are the questions we need answered? And I don't think it's very successful to go down the road of feeling limited because the labs cannot give us that information. I think we should carve out that possibility for them.
Yeah.
I echo what she said. I mean, I don't think, the laboratories and their capacity should drive how you regulate water quality or public health or any one of the agencies that we provide data to. But I think that's what's happening, right? There's not enough labs. We can't do it. We can't provide the data for you. But if you push it, it's like the movie. You build it, they will come. You put it in the permit, and the laboratories will be innovative, and they will develop the methods, and you guys will get the meaningful data that you want. So I support exactly what Diana is saying.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many meetings I go to where a lot of times people are representing concern about a laboratory method, but they're really talking about comfort with the data and what it's going to be used to turn into some sort of intervention strategy. So there's all these, they all sort of interrelate back to the same thing, and I'm trying to find ways. I think we're talking about ways, but there may be ways to get out ahead of this with ELAP and have conversations in the space of all laboratories trying to do a method before you're talking about the application of a particular sampling effort in a particular geographic space with a lot of issues, right? Because you're just talking about the method as a whole, and you're not talking about what it means to discharge your X or Y. So there's a lot of advantage in what I'm seeing to using that ELAP as sort of a leading edge to have conversations about why we're collecting data, which kind of questions can it answer, what do we expect of it when we're trying to answer those questions, and setting up a rubric like that. So that's great.
So if I could do a little PSA on the Environmental Laboratory Technical Advisory Committee, it's required in the Environmental Laboratory Accreditation Act that we convene one. And so, since coming over to the board, we've got a great group of committee members that represent all different state agency partners. So your quality assurance officer is a committee member, and we have small, commercial, large
Renee Spears, call her if you have any questions.
Laboratories that represent, and we're always asking the agency partners to come to the committee and let them know, what are you looking at? What are you wanting to start to regulate, so that they can get the word out to, like, the new pyrethroid methods that Danny McClure needs for Central Valley, so they can start pushing the envelope and develop those methods. But it's a perfect opportunity to, talk to the community instead of just a survey. Right. And these folks, they represent national large companies and even small municipalities that are pushing the envelope. So it's a great venue for you regulators that are in the room. Like when you're writing a permit right now and you're thinking, I want to start, to maybe do worm toxicity, DTSC is thinking of that, tell the committee, and they will be the conduit for you to get the information that you need.
So I'm going to do one final sort of dive into this cave with you guys, and it has to do with feeding it back on itself, because at some point data becomes available to decide on the next permit round and things like that, and we talked a little bit about this, but we have intervention tools that we use. It's writing new permit requirements. It may be taking enforcement actions. It may be a combination of those two. It may be a policy, a basin plan amendment, a statewide policy on trash or something like that. When we do that, we start back over again, because we just talked about trash collection. It's coming. It's not exactly mandated in the statewide basis yet, but it's coming because of something that we started with the board 3 years ago. So I'm going to create my sense of urgency again. We don't have time to do this cycle in the 15, 20-year lifespans of revisiting what made sense and what worked and what didn't work. How do we do better with that? Who wants to go first? And maybe we could focus it on enforcement. There's actually a very specific question Carl wrote. Can we show if the need for NPDES time schedule orders or other enforcement mechanisms are trending down or changing, actually, is another way to put it. The need for enforcement orders, can the data answer that question today? And is it the right question?
I'll jump in there. I'm usually shy about talking.
Yeah, I know, Richard. Yeah, don't feel shy, please.
No, we can't. And thanks, Carl, for the question. It's a great question. I wish we could do that. We'd see time schedule orders, especially, what we were just talking about with copper, especially for toxic metals. The time schedules seem to be never ending. And,
so let me push, why can't we answer? Is there a data gap, or is there not the analysis being done of data that's there?
I think what we need to show is that there is a uniform trend for copper, let's say, and that dropped because of some event, and which would mean an event that caused compliance.
Right, an intervention like source control or
well, source control would be the same thing.
Or treatment.
If you document that you did source control and it was effective, and you can show a clear data drop. Although metals tend to be spikes as opposed to a constant value. So
are we even collecting that data? Would we know in CWIX if a facility under a time schedule order for copper did something like a source control training?
Well, that's the interesting thing. If you're doing priority pollutant sampling in 1 month during the year, I don't think you're going to show real good trend analysis, and that's one of the problems. And I think one of the things that you could look at in terms of enforcement orders, compliance orders, and whether those are effective at achieving compliance. There's another way of achieving compliance, and that's relaxing the permit. And so, how do you go about doing that? And that would be an event that would bring them into compliance, although it wouldn't show a laboratory reduction in the amount of copper. But source control, conventional types of treatment, to achieve compliance, you should be able to do that with good, reliable, consistent data.
So you think that the copper data alone could help answer that question? You wouldn't need extra data sets if the copper data were of the right study design, quote unquote?
Well, I think along with the compliance schedule, if a different monitoring subset went along with the compliance schedule to
get more granular data that you would...
That made it significant, yes.
Diana?
Yes. In the NPDES permit process, every 5 years, a reasonable potential analysis is conducted on if that discharger needs numeric final effluent limitation. I don't believe the measure is in the number of enforcement orders that the compliance that the discharger is in final compliance. I think the measure is the next time we do the permit, is there still reasonable potential for that constituent? So let's say copper. Unless it's based on the ambient, which we know that the discharger has done as much as they can, but they still get that final effluent limitation. If that 5-year term of that permit was successful, next time around, that discharger will not have a concentration of copper in their effluent limit that triggers reasonable potential.
But one of the premises you said a few minutes ago I'll bring into this is that the data sets available for reasonable potential analysis should be made the most robust and consistent, right? So that, because we're doing this sort of once every 5 years, and it's setting the tone for 5 years at a time.
Exactly.
So we should do that the best we can.
Yes, and lots of times an effluent limit or further monitoring is required in an individual NPDES permit is because we don't have enough data either to place an effluent limitation in the permit or to remove an existing effluent limitation in the permit. And that is where the data fails us. And also an area where the data fails us is when models are created and then we base the permit requirements maybe more lenient, maybe more stringent based on a model, but the environment changes or that model is never verified. And so 5 years down the line, we find that we still have the same water quality issues with the matching up of that effluent with the receiving water, and so we still have final effluent limitations. So I would say the success in protecting water quality for those effluent limitations that go through a reasonable potential analysis, like CTR, is actually no longer having reasonable potential for that discharge.
Eliminating the pollutant.
Exactly, yes.
Any other thoughts?
I would just say, since it is an enforcement action, that, and Carl's question is that enforcement action effective? I think that should be largely separate.
So for those of you, let me actually, I should have said this. A time schedule order goes on top of a permit. And the permit comes, it says, and here's your expectation, do this. If you vary out of that, let's say it's for copper, a time schedule order comes along and says, well, you need to bring that back down to where we expect you to be over this time. And it imposes some other requirements. So it's meant to sort of correct, it's a corrective action, it's a type of enforcement action, but it's meant to bring you back down to that compliance level, just to, for everyone who doesn't understand that, sorry.
And that's why I just say, to me, it should just be treated differently than permit renewal. I just, it should be an action on its own that, there's a whole thing about enforcement and, whether it's effective. And
well, I'll say that I took my job at State Board in 2000 because I was recruited by John Norton for the Compliance Assurance and Enforcement Unit, and the basis of that was that the CalPERG folks had shamed the state of California water boards for not doing proper enforcement, including time schedules that had gone back in City of Pacifica and other places for decades, and nobody had ever revisited them. And this time schedule thing is a big deal in California. It's a kick-the-can perception problem that in this day and age we should have some data that helps answer it. But we got better. Mandatory minimum penalty laws came out of that sort of era, and we have those now, and those sort of kick in. People go over and they get hit, and that's a disincentive enough. But what we're really trying to do is improve this data ecosystem to actually improve water quality, not just reduce enforcement orders or what have you. I'm also very interested in this idea of being more cost efficient. I think there's way fertile ground here to explore on that. So, and what I hear is that the regional potential analysis there's these critical path steps where things get set in place for a long period of time. And if we do them better, we all sort of win. We get more confidence on the water quality side. We get more maybe cost savings on the discharger and the fee payer side. We get more reliability on the data itself, and especially if we partner with people that want to work with us. So that was one of the things is maybe we can focus on reasonable potential, critical path, and bringing data sets and working with regions that are doing it disparately and try to find some way that's not a policy, but it's a common sense way to approach that. The other thing I remember hearing is, Danny, you talked about tools, just simple tools to look at, hardness, water effects ratio effects, data, bringing data together and making more sense of it in terms of information and a data visualization as a permit writer, as an evaluator for things like that. Using the ELAP features and services to try to achieve interest, we can have conversations about laboratory methods that are in more of a safe space because you're talking about the method and how a lab should do it, not about what's going to happen at the end of the day when I get the bad numbers. So, am I missing any sort of big roll-up things? And then I'm going to turn it to the audience for questions.
I would just say, since you brought up MMPs, I hear from people all.
Shouldn't have brought up MMPs.
I just hear from people all the time that MMPs are a part of the cost of doing business, and it's just pay the money every year or whenever they assess it. And keep doing what you're doing.
It's like mandatory sentencing. The legislature got involved and they probably didn't need to, but now we're living with that. So
I think in terms of Carl's question, is that enforcement effective? I don't think the data is showing that.
Right. No, I mean, there's a lot of things. MMPs does a lot of things of raising questions like severity, right? It treats a BOD exceedance of 1 milligram per liter the same as a copper exceedance, which one's going to really kill things and one's just more food for some bugs, right? So that's one of the problems with MMPs, but I could go on myself, but I think what we ought to do is use data to try to make a point, and maybe the legislation energy would change out there. But right now, it's actually, we're still kind of being scrutinized, I think.
Can I say something on behalf of the dischargers?
Please.
In working in several permitting programs throughout the water boards, I'm a firm believer that 80% of the dischargers out there want to protect the receiving waters that they discharge into, and they want those beneficial uses protected.
Yep.
So with my discharger hat on, I would just say that the dischargers are on our team in general, and enforcement should be saved for those 20% that still don't get it. Mm-hmm.
I would agree and say it's even greater than 80%.
Okay, cool. Kumbaya.
Well, and a follow-up on that, especially with things like CECs and pesticides that are coming out in wastewater effluent, that the treatment plants aren't doing anything wrong. It's just they weren't made to treat that, and it's problematic in that it can create a disincentive for generation of the good data and so hopefully we can find some way around, and maybe some of the data qualification tools, or we've done studies where we didn't say which location it came from, but those kind of, hopefully we can find some ways that we don't that we encourage the generation of data as opposed to discouraging it, because there are going to be some challenges for especially some of the newer like flea meds that are coming out in effluent now.
So we got to get real. I just keep saying this from my OEMA chair. I used to be a regulator, recovering, but the future is here. We've got challenges that are going to be really costly as a civilization society, and so we just can't just keep operating the way we used to, because we're going to have to start turning on a dime and changing our plan. We turned on a dime 6 months ago. It was the wrong direction. We got to turn again. We got to have this sort of new culture of appreciating what we can learn from data. And so I think these ideas of data being locked up and people's perceptions about what people are doing wrong with data or right with data. We got to get over that and just sort of, as an organization, turn into a more transparent, data-driven thing. And any other thoughts? I want to open it up to the audience to ask panelists questions or make comments. Amy's been very patient.
I'm not that patient, but I try. So a lot of what I was hearing was coming back to the idea of data in, data out. And so we talked, Christine talked about ELAP and how it might be stage 0, where we talk about methods and how that data is even collected and then reported. And I see this throughout all the stages of your diagram that you had, where data can be changed, or we can start asking more questions and requiring different things from the data. And I'm thinking particularly in the NPDES permit writing sort of process that we go through, and how important data is from stage 0 all the way back into turning it into information and then feeding it back into the system. And I think we're no longer in that age where we have to share computers or don't have them, but we have all of this stuff at our fingertips. But it's a real challenge for government agencies and the staff that are doing the writing to get this interaction with the data in a meaningful way. And so I think our job should be, like Greg said, to put the data out there, make sure it's of good quality, and hope that others can help us answer the questions. So through APIs and web services, and using you all in the private sector or nonprofit sector to turn that data into something useful, and then us being willing and welcoming of those services to use our own data in permitting in the future. So I just wanted to comment, I think I see where the data fits all of your processes and all of your thoughts, and just encourage that we look at it more holistically.
Thank you. That's a very nice summary kind of thing.
I wonder about it being a benefit in cost saving, and if just a step of having a single list of values that are acceptable for each of the commonly used fields, so that the siloing is more easy to bring these different data sets together, because you have, even within the agency I work for, one database might have a chemical name spelled differently or include total in the copper thing, and so then you're taking them apart and putting them back together, then taking them back apart, and it just seems like
a response in the bookkeeping.
Yes, well, and then for the ELAP program, if the Division of Drinking Water kind of sounds like they might be doing something like that all the way upstream, so that the labs, they would save time not having to put the data into 15 different formats for the people that are their customers.
Anyone here from the lab?
So it's crazy making a little bit, the number of possibilities.
So yeah, that's a little bit different, but you're talking about on the loading side. When you're loading data into a database, well, there's a couple of questions. We have two databases listed here that both receive chemistry parameters from laboratories, CWIX and SEDEN.
Mm-hmm.
There's 4 at least others, maybe 5 in the water board that do the same thing. They all do it a little differently.
Right.
We heard from Geographic this morning. They get a lot of their stuff through EDF, which is a format. CWIX and SMARTS uses that sometimes.
Yeah.
We also have CIDWIS that is trying out a EDT. It's trying out a pilot program where LIMS systems can start speaking directly to things, right? But we're doing it in 4, 5, 7 different ways at the water board. What if we just stood up a laboratory receiving catcher's net, and laboratories could talk to it, and we could then sort it out and send it to the right place? So these are the kind of questions that I'm trying to ask.
Common language.
It would save so much time. You have no idea, or you do have a huge idea of how painful it is to try to get the valid values to match for this, but it's different for that.
And how useless it is if you put it in.
Oh, 5.
Right.
Oops. Yeah.
Right.
So it's one of those things that is a pet peeve of mine, but I'm trying to make progress on it, but
I think it would save
really
money.
Hard. Yeah.
So if I could just say something about that, laboratories are much like, dischargers. I mean, there's different ones. There's big ones that have a lot of money. There's small ones that are in small little towns up in, the North Coast. So having a LIMS system is not something that all labs have. And so, you have to consider that they don't have the resources and time. There are just labs that have one or two people that service a small water system or a disadvantaged community somewhere in the middle of nowhere. So you have to consider those things, when you think about holistically trying to get everybody on.
But even if it improved the flow of 60% or 70% of the data, it would be a huge reliever of both data quality problems that arise, but also cost.
Absolutely.
Greg, I did want to say that there is somebody from a lab representing a lab from online.
Oh, hi. Thanks for being online and representing a lab. I think we had a question back here, and then Selena.
I guess it's a comment maybe. I totally agree with that, and I think earlier you said data is like water. I think data reporting can also be like water in that if it's a fractured system with many ports of entry and little control. So I don't know how to do that to facilitate that, but could one way be through maybe ELAP that actually the laboratories are reporting to one central area, whether it's Seedon, they're familiar and trained with the business rules versus in Region 6 we recently did a Seedon training for citizens, water quality groups, RCDs that are collecting data. It was really challenging for them to even understand the business rules. So I think the quality of the input would be improved if the laboratories themselves maybe got that data into Seedon. And then there's the question, maybe you can write it into the MPDS permit that it's required, as part of methods that have to be used.
Of those, and they all have different life cycles. But yeah, there's a way to get it into requirements faster.
Yeah. And then that data could be considered for the integrated report. But
I've thought about this a lot. I think, we're not alone in this as an agency either. There's other state agencies that collect the same type of information from the same exact laboratories. And so there might be a way and an advantage to stand up something that's outside of a single agency that's sort of like a California laboratory receiving system or something like that.
Yeah. So I have something to say about that. So, the 700 laboratories that we accredit, half of them are municipal agencies. So they're captive labs that report to their own agencies that are regulated by you. So the agencies don't regulate the laboratories. We regulate the laboratories, and they regulate the dischargers. So unless we all have the same set of regulations, following each other, then you're going to have that disconnect.
Yeah.
And then you have the whole business aspect of laboratories. There's commercial laboratories that provide analysis for all of everyone that is regulated. So then that would be very difficult for you all as regulatory agencies to be regulating a commercial facility. So there's
so many steps along the way so having that hypothetical question out there creates conversations like maybe the first step is just common valid values, right?
Absolutely.
And then you just make those available for people who want to do any reporting. You're not mandating, you're not the one that receives it, but you're helping improve the standardization of the data just by steps.
Same convention for all, and no matter who you're reporting to. Well, the problem, and I hear it from the lab, is just as we say, there are so many different databases that they input into in different conventions. So until the agencies or the water boards get that one database.
Well, I don't want one database. I want one catcher's mitt. I want one catcher's mitt that you could put code behind it and make it smart.
But it's great we're having this conversation, something that has not been daylighted, that has been, under the rug because ELAP was not in this agency. We were at Public Health, so I'm really happy that we're having this conversation.
That's one of the state doesn't have to be innovative. The technology thing is moving on its own, way ahead of us. And there's every year goes by, I see new things that it's wow, we don't have to innovate that. So this idea of building these sort of lakes or whatever you want to call them, you throw data into and it starts structuring it and sorting it and making sense of it. They exist. So we just have to be nimble and agile enough and value it. We have to have these conversations like we're having of what do you gain by doing that? It sounds really scary and risky to think about that, but what do we actually gain? Well, flip that around on the side of the people that are regulated by us, and there's gains there too, huge gains. I mean, I don't want to take labs and consultants out of business, but a lot of money is made by wrangling people's data to get it to us. We didn't think about how we wanted it. We just said, give it to us this way, and we built a database, but people make a really good living sometimes wrangling data because we didn't think about it. So,
Greg, I have a quick comment.
Yeah.
So I have to say our state and regional water board staff have gone through the years spending a lot of effort training dischargers on how to enter data into CWICs for the NPDES permits. If there is any gain or any additional gain we can get from enforcement is actually enforcing the entry of data into our system, because I think the regional boards and state board as permit writers, we have gone for years working with data sets out of CWICs that don't have the method detection levels, don't have the minimum levels, whether they wanted to insert them or they didn't have them. So sometimes I think we have to think, how can we tighten up our existing processes that are working or would work better if all the players were at the table doing really good work.
I think that's a good point. I worry a little bit about the image that we would give of taking enforcement action against somebody for not putting data into a structure that we didn't design for easy data entry.
Enforcing what we're requiring, just following through, even if.
But I think there's a role there. There's definitely
right.
certain cases of data entry problems that rise to the level of enforcement, I think, in my mind. So, yeah.
One thing that I heard Greg say is that generally we don't always have information on the same timeframes that we need to make decisions. And so ways to help that are open data exchange, sort of decision-driven experimental designs for the way that we collect data. That's difficult because different agencies have different decisions that they have to make, but we can try and identify some synergies between those decisions that need to be made. But also another thing we can do is to try to make more of the data that we do collect, right? And to use a dirty word, often that involves using a model of one kind or another, a numeric or a statistical model, to try to get that information on shorter time frames. A good example I can think of is in the Chesapeake Bay. They do, it's called SPARROW, I think, spatial regressions on watershed attributes for their nutrient program there. As priorities, opportunities, technology shifts over time, if you're someone like a stormwater manager, often you need information at a greater degree of spatial granularity or timeframes that the monitoring data, ambient monitoring data, doesn't provide, and so those types of tools can be helpful for that too.
Yeah, and I'll really make my only quick commentary on modeling is the pace of open data movement and open government has been so fast that I think modeling is trying to catch up. There's a lot of intellectual property that's tied up in things like called models, and the desire to be transparent isn't as prevalent as you would have it just people showing their direct measured data. But I think the forces, and it's not regulatory forces, it's market forces, are going to, because there's open source models that do the same thing that your $2 million model might do, right? Maybe not as the same, but maybe faster and better, and you can tweak it. So that's one of the interesting things that I think about this, because data is data. Some of it's measured, some of it's modeled, some of it's calculated using other things, right? So, but it's still data at the end of the day. But we all have to live in this space and make sense of it. Yep, absolutely. Understanding it, and including the uncertainty that came along with it. Yeah.
Just to go back to what we were speaking about with CWICs, and someone asked earlier about if there were checks on the various fields, and there are checks so that you can only input data that has this, spelled out the right name, the right analyte name that is wanted in the database. But then there are other fields like MDL, ML, RL. You don't have to populate them, and you can still import your file. And I think someone earlier today talked about some like UI/QC process, building it into into the database itself so that those mistakes can't get in there. Like your forest, it won't take the file if you don't have the proper fields. And that would prevent the need for any enforcement around.
No, that's absolutely critical. Using the machine to help you, you know. We code it for making a button be a color. Why not make it code it to actually help us improve data quality too?
Right.
Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Lena? Oh, that's right. Sorry.
So you had mentioned earlier about the data silos, wanting those to go away. Does that mean the RDCs are then going to go away? Because there are some of those still around. They're not quite contracted, but they're still doing stuff. So are those going to end and then it gets more to the portal type format? Or
I think the appropriate answer on that is, you know, we're going to unplug the patient and see what happens. I mean, we don't have
a stake in whether. You might want to say what an RDC is.
Oh, regional data center. So Seedon has a business model that we inherited. It's one of those examples of somebody literally gave it to us and retired kind of a thing. They worked at a different agency. They came here. Here's your database, and I'm out of here. And then we had to make sense of it. And one of the things that it had was a replicate-based business model built into it with this idea, and it was a good idea, that it would encourage businesses to serve as a go-between of data people providing data and the data entry itself. So these regional data centers were part of the model. There's literally 5 versions of Seedon out there. 1 is Swamp and 4 are regional data centers. And they, on a weekly basis, they come back together and say, hey, how are you doing? What'd you do this week? Oh, I gained some new parameters. What'd you do? And they have like some weird discussion, and it takes a lot of energy to make that whole family a whole again every week. So one of the things that we have decided strategically with Seedon is that we don't want to have a replicate-based model again when we rebuild it. And we're in the process, like the Gears presentation earlier, we're in stage 2 of the stage gate process to rebuild Seedon. But we're not going to have it be replicated. But that doesn't mean we're going to get rid of RDCs. We don't have a stake in RDCs. Some of the RDCs have already said we're kind of done. We didn't really like that job anyway. Others, maybe they're making a good market out of what they do, and they'll stick around. So there's still a need for people to help facilitate data conversations, whether it's data entry, or maybe they have clients that want them to help make sense of the data on the coming outside. So I don't have a stake in whether RDCs make it or don't make it, but I will tell you their role in controlling data workflow in Seedon is going to be gone. They will not have a control gate function in that, unless it's a constructive one, like they're helping enforce quality. Because right now, actually, one of the good things about Seedon is it does have this built-in loading checking system that really validates and makes sure that you're not putting in a ridiculous number and choosing a wrong value, right? So that's what the RDCs kind of do today. That part's not going to go away if they stick around. But any other questions or comments over here?
Hi, thanks everybody. Just to harp on the format consistency subject a little bit more, I'm a consultant and one of those who makes his living from wrangling all sorts of data types into whatever it needs to be. I don't consider that a good use of my time, and I'm sure a lot of you don't either. And I would just encourage you to here at the state in general, if there's some sort of consistency or consensus that can be reached, to really pursue that, because California as a leader in this field in general, I think can be listened to and lead the way in that aspect as well. I think the federal EPA has made some progress with their EQUIS format and are doing pretty well with that. If there's one answer, I feel like I've heard today that CWIX is kind of the way it is, and I know I don't work for that a lot, but it seems like you're really deep in there and it's going pretty well. GeoTracker seems like they feel like their hands are kind of tied with the way things are. Anyway, if there's a way to all come together and...
Do you work with CIDWIS mostly? Is that what I'm gathering, the drinking water side?
I work with GeoTracker mostly.
Oh, GeoTracker,
yeah,
okay.
Groundwater.
So maybe what we need, each one of these databases has a users group, I think, sort of, something. But I don't know if we have one that kind of brings them all together to talk about best practices needed across the organizational board. So what I'm hearing is maybe we need to have some way to reach out to the consultants like you, the consultants in the CWIX users group, the consultants in the whatever, the people that are doing the work on the outside to put data in. Maybe we should form some sort of cross-bridge thing.
And that Caster Smith that you mentioned, I mean, if there was a statewide key table that you could match rather than having to match each valid value, hugely beneficial.
Yeah. No, and honestly, the presentation earlier today, if you didn't see it, watch it or listen to it. Gears provides a lot of infrastructure and architecture opportunities that go beyond what he was talking about. And so, the data that they're trying to collect is one type of data, but it's not unique to that. So there's a lot of advantages and Seedon's doing very similar work. We just had a request for information from a bunch of vendors, and people's heads were spinning with some of the cool things that, can be done and how different they are from each other. There's different approaches. So I think the horizon looks pretty positive, but it's still, we need to get better, faster, sooner, cheaper. Any other questions or comments from the audience? Any last thoughts from the panel? Oh, observations. Anything?
So just an observation I was going to offer. So I'm a consumer of some of your APIs, and one of the things that we've learned, even with just the ones that are there, and some of the other data that we can get as well from other sources, is you find all sorts of latent constructs that lie deep in this data. And so just one thing I would offer is that even if you don't see a use for a particular data set you've got as far as putting it into an API, or you're not sure that the data is good enough for an API, just put it in there anyways. Like, give us a warning, maybe warn us on the data.ca.gov, right? But all the smarts data, all the CWIX data, we could use all of it, even if you're not quite sure that you're like, maybe I don't really want to publish this out yet, because there's a lot of stuff I know that we still have to script ways to download it all through the old system rather than just hit data.ca.gov to get it.
I'd love to do that. Yeah. No, we're making progress. That is exactly what I feel like my job is to make more of our give me your all data requests. And it's hard because it hits programs that have things that they have to work on that aren't related to giving me the all file, quote unquote, or a series of flat files that adds up to the all file. And then it hits the DIT folks too, because each one of those hits is like a programmer's time. They have to go in and build that query to build that new thing. And we have lots of things that sort of do that, but none of them that do it exactly, right? So you got to stand in line. It's a really great point, and I thank you for making it, but I just want to share with you, and on behalf of my partners here that work with me, I ask the same things, but I know that it hits them as new work, and it takes away from their work that they need to do on other things. And it's a finite amount of work that we all have here. So,
Greg, for retroactive understanding of what you guys just talked about, what's API?
It's an application program interface, and so I went to a really good talk. I wish I could can this guy's talk, but he described APIs a year ago at a thing as an ecosystem, because they're little servants that do things. They hand data over from one place to another, and they have different functions. Some of them they simply just do cleaning. They just sort of go and they maintain. They're like the janitor APIs. And then some are like, you ask them for something and they go look for it. They kind of do work for you. But they're little programs that talk between data sets that hand data back and forth. And it's how your phones work. Transfer data is an API on your phone is hitting an API somewhere else, and it's making the data flow back and forth. But they're all over on my diagram because they're little chunks of code and applications that sort of make the data flow. They go in between these layers of life stages because if you don't have those arrows that say web service and APIs, it's call up Rafa or call up a programmer and make me the data on a daily basis. I'm going to call you again tomorrow. Make me the data. So, they're really important to automate and understand organizationally because they're hard work to build in some cases, but they provide efficiencies at the end of the day that they're infrastructure. It's like the pipes. You don't have to carry water from the kitchen to the bathroom. You got a pipe that does it now. So, thanks. Good question.
Another way to look at it is it's almost like when you interact with a database, you see a user interface. An API is essentially a machine-readable equivalent of that same thing. So where you would look at it, and that's kind of your perception, and then you would enter your data or do whatever with it, you can write a program that simply speaks the API. So it's just a machine-readable equivalent.
Yeah, and another, like, I'm on a project looking at the State Water Board's website and trying to evaluate it for the next kind of move that we want to do. And we talk about users all the time, but this is a great example of users today aren't the same users they were 5 years ago. Half the users, maybe a third of the users today are machines. They're using data, they're hitting things to make data move around from machine to machine, website to website. Your interagency sharing, East Bay Mud is hitting CWICs to make sure that they're submitting their things on time or something like that. It's machines, it's not humans. So you have to design things for both audiences now, humans and machines. So, back of the room.
This is just for my clarification. I'm in the same boat as Diane with the API. So would it be if, for instance, you're on a swamp monitoring location, you want to pull up that data from SEED and the API does the work for you? It goes into SEED and it selects the regional board, it selects the constituent, it selects the monitoring location, pulls that out so you see it on the front page.
There is an API that...
Is that an API?
And so the API would be a program that might focus on geocode of the location you're at.
Right. And pulled out what you wanted, what you were looking for.
It replaces that search screen where you say what you just said, county, Humboldt, city, Arcata, it replaces all those search fields. Mm-hmm. And that's one form of an API is you can actually use it to hit relational databases specifically targeted. You can also have APIs that just spit out formatted data. Here's all the geospatial data I have in this zone, or here's what I have. And you can, there's different forms of them, but they really are, they make your world work, believe it or not. We're all stuck on our phones these days, whether we look at them or just rely on them once a day to do something. It's all working because of structure around APIs that have been built for 10, 20, 15 years now. So it's a matter of the water board and our regulatory mindsets getting up to speed with appreciating the value of data flowing at that kind of a level, because we've kind of lived in this comfort zone of hitting data, using data. Maybe there's even comfort of not having data accessible. So APIs change all that, and open data changes all that. Any other last thoughts? Well, thanks for everyone for being patient to stay through all this. Really appreciate it. If you have any thoughts or feedback, don't be afraid to email me, reach out. Thank you for coming today. Go get some turkey legs outside. Just kidding. And see you at the next data fair.